Good afternoon. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. I'm Bill Lacey, the director of the Institute. We're so delighted that you could join us for the first session of our National Post-Election Conference today. We have some great guests. I think you're going to hear a fantastic discussion, and we appreciate your being present. I want to remind everyone that we pride ourselves on courtesy and civility here at the Dole Institute, and you may not agree with in fact, I can promise you won't agree with everything you hear over the next couple of hours, but please do treat our guests with courtesy and civility. We'll take a break today about 3:30. If you join us tomorrow, we'll be taking a break then as well, so you'll have a chance to get up and stretch your legs. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of each of our two sessions today and tomorrow morning. We would ask you to queue up at the microphone that's over on the far side of our room and ask you to ask just one brief question. And you can ask it of the panel, or you can ask it of a specific individual if someone says something you would like to question along the way. I want to recognize the fact that we have students and faculty here from Pittsburgh State, Wichita State, Emporia State, and Rockhurst, along with KU. So welcome all. Glad you all could join us. The structure today, we're going to focus on the lead up to the election and the results. And tomorrow we will focus on kind of the implications of the results and talk a little bit about 2020. So it should be fun. It should be very enlightening, and I'm sure that we'll all enjoy it tremendously. Let me very briefly introduce our panelists. You will find their names and their positions in your program, and also I believe we have some packets of biographies. If you're interested in a more full biography that is back at the table, you can pick that up. But I'm going to do very brief introductions because I want to get right to our discussion. To my left is Katie Glueck from McClatchy, Randy Brown with Edison Research, which does the exit polling, Michelle Whatley, who is a Democratic strategist and consultant, Jessica Flanagain, who is a Republican strategist with Axiom Strategies, Kelly Dietrich, who's a president of the National Democratic Training Committee and was our fall 2018 fellow. Welcome back, Kelly. Jennifer Duffy of the world-famous Cook Political Report. Charlie has been here a couple times, and we're glad that Jennifer can join us today. Jason Bresler is the political director at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Eliza Collins is from USA Today. And Jim Jonas is with Centennial Strategies, and he is our spring 2018 fellow. So delighted to have you back as well, Jim. Delighted to have everyone else here. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's go back to January of 2017 and kind of do a reset after the very surprising win by President Trump. I'm wondering what your thoughts were at the time about how that would shape politics and how it might affect the upcoming midterm elections. Don't all jump in at once.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So look, from the Democratic Congressional Campaigns Committee, we saw in 2017, right after the inauguration and the swearing in and the marches across the country, we knew very early on that, from our perspective, there was a level of enthusiasm that we had never seen before, that was sort of untapped. And one of the things that we did very early on, because we knew that we were either going to arm the rebels or they were going to overpower us. So we went out and put a lot of organizers on the ground very, very early on, including two districts here in Kansas 2 and in Kansas 3, and started to work with organizations that were building up that had never been around before. Whether it was swing left organizations that were across the country or various other grassroots organizations that we knew very, very early on that if we did not empower and work with them, which had not usually been the role of various national committees in the past, that we weren't going to have a seat at the table, let alone be at the head of the table anymore. So that is one thing, and especially just given the last cycle and the sort of that we were dealing with ourselves, but just the sort of what I guess the word I'm looking for is resistance against national committees that we saw everywhere. Dealing mainly with the 2016, presidential election with Bernie and the Clinton folks, there just being a non-cohesive committee, and even though, we're different than the National Committee, our only objective at the DCCC is either to keep the majority or win the majority. It doesn't matter. When you're a national committee, you're going to get blamed for the good and you're going to get blamed for the bad, and sometimes be pat on the back for the good. So we knew right away we had to get in from our perspective and work with the, sort of the new insurgency that we had never seen before.
Jason mentioned the marches that were taking place in January in response to President Trump's inauguration. And I can tell you, having covered Republicans at that time, those marches were very concerning to a lot of Republican members of Congress. And in fact, a lot of them were privately getting advice from top Republican Party officials telling them, don't do town halls because there are so many people who are so angry right now in reaction to the president's victory that the optics there are just actually not going to be very good for you. And so if you remember, across the country, we saw a lot of Republican members actually canceling their town halls, doing teletown halls, or really restricting those events on their schedules. And that was actually directive from sort of top party officials because there was a lot of concern about all of the energy, all of the motivation that they were seeing on the left. Of course, it was the flip side in 2010 when there was a lot of Republican energy, a lot of Republican anger in response to President Obama. And this time around, we saw that be true on the other side of the aisle.
And one famous moment of that was in Virginia's 7th Congressional District. That was Dave Bratt, who was the Freedom Caucus member who had toppled Eric Cantor in 2014. This was a red district. You guys recruited a very strong candidate, but this was supposed to be a red district. But these women started showing up. He did have a few town halls. They started showing up, and there's this famous quote where he says, "The women are in my grill." And I think that quote could kind of be this whole election. And he stopped having town halls, and the seat flipped.
We saw it as well. We hold trainings all around the country, very much a grassroots organization, and we saw a level of enthusiasm that was frankly unprecedented in my career in politics. And it was not the traditional institutional Democrats showing up. It was grassroots donors. It was people who felt after the Trump victory scared, angry, fed up, pissed off, and wanted to do something about it. So we saw it not only at the congressional level, which it clearly translated into, but at the local level, city council, school boards. People wanted to be active. They wanted ways to get involved in a way that we had never seen before. We held training in Idaho and had 200 people show up in Idaho. Like, no offense to anyone from Idaho here. I didn't know we had 200 Democrats from Idaho. That's fantastic. I want 200 Democrats from Idaho.
From the Republican standpoint, I think people were, there were a lot of Republicans surprised that Donald Trump was the president of the United States. And so I think there was a period of time where people circled the wagon, some held back, and some were skeptical of what might happen. And I think there were maybe some false starts at the beginning of his work with Congress when you think about the efforts with relation to Obamacare. And I think it was really where people started to buy in, and by people I mean the more traditional kind of establishment Republicans once the tax cuts passed. By the same token, there are people engaged in the Republican Party that we haven't seen before. It was definitely a different coalition that he brought to the table, and I think one of the challenges of the Republicans nationally in our committees is to really analyze what is that coalition, because it was obviously a winning coalition, and how do you work with those people, bring them into the fold, and recreate that.
A little more to Jessica's point, as an operative, I think there was some concern about what would happen to down ballot races and candidates who would end up running in the midterms. In Missouri, Trump won the state by almost 20 points in the primaries in 2016. For instance, Bernie won Kansas. He won the Kansas primaries. Those were not wins that we expected, and so there was a concern about how that would impact midterm candidates, this whole rise of the anti-establishment candidate and what that would look like. Trump won the state in Missouri by almost 20 points, but all of the Democratic candidates on the statewide races also lost their seats and effectively turned Missouri from purple to essentially a red state. Republicans now, to this day, hold almost all of the statewide seats with the exception of one. So it was, I think for me as an operative, there was some concern about what it would look like to run candidates in a midterm election and in states where Republicans were winning and winning big.
I think it's safe to say that a lot of Americans were a little bit surprised by the results, and I know I certainly was. Let me follow up with this question. Were congressional Republicans prepared for a Trump win?
I think you could tell by the number of retirements, unprecedented retirements this cycle. I do not think a lot of them knew how to respond in this day and age, right? You had from everywhere, including Kansas to conservative districts to very swing, urban and suburban districts. I think it's pretty clear that those that a lot of them were not battle tested and clearly weren't ready to compete in this day and age.
My short answer to that, to the question of whether congressional Republicans were prepared for a Trump win, is no, absolutely not. If you recall a number of their statements as late as October of 2016, you saw so many of them on the record repeatedly critical of Trump's campaign. That was especially the case when the Access Hollywood video came out, really openly being concerned about his candidacy, and there were a lot of people openly saying at the time that he was going to bring down the Republican majorities with him. Of course, that did not happen, and then what we saw in 2017 was how a lot of Republican lawmakers had to sort of readjust in the Trump era, and you saw lawmakers who had previously been quite critical of him in the 2016 campaign, whether they were in Nevada, whether they were in Alabama, suddenly, or in Arizona, suddenly having to deal with the critical comments that they had made in the past that were suddenly really problematic in Republican primary scenarios.
And also to Jessica's point, the president had some fits and starts with Congress, with the Republican Congress. He was not someone who knew a lot of the way things worked. He did not have a very robust team at first, and so dealing between Congress and the White House was very strained. Later on, he brought in some more kind of seasoned political operatives, but in the beginning, his campaign was run by his friends, basically, and that's who he brought over to the White House. And so there was some real distrust as well from Republicans in Congress. Later on, as things started to move through, the tax bill, they did come together on health care, but the president also was willing to throw them under the bus in the beginning. They passed that big House Obamacare repeal, and then he had this big Rose Garden ceremony, and then a little bit later called the bill mean. So there was real concern about what the president would do. He might say one thing one day and then turn the next.
Well, then let me follow up and ask the same question, but from a different perspective, because I want to change it a little bit. Were congressional Republicans, would they have been prepared for any Republican victory? Because one of the things that surprised me was they didn't seem ready with a legislative agenda.
I would say that very few people were prepared for a Trump victory in 16, and then 17 is spent, first part of 17 is spent trying to figure out what is a Trump victory? What is he going to do? And that, the cynical part of me is we still don't know what he's going to do because I haven't looked at his Twitter in 20 minutes. So it's a new political reality. You're dealing with, in my opinion, be interested in everyone else's, this is not a traditional administration that plans things out and develops strategy for months and weeks in advance and brings in allies and works with the House and Senate leaders to make certain everything goes smooth. It's much more ad hoc.
Well, absolutely. First of all, let me apologize for my voice. Apparently, I left it on the tarmac at DCA this morning. The Senate was a little bit different from the House. I mean, they did stay together. But to your point, the way that this usually plays itself out is whoever wins the presidency has a thick binder called the first 100 days. And so the leadership in Congress takes their cues from the first 100 days. There was no 100-day agenda in the Trump White House. I mean, I don't disagree with you. I mean, it's sort of day-to-day, minute-to-minute. But there is definitely, he didn't give the leadership a lot to work with. In fact, he gave them nothing to work with. I mean, they spent a lot of time explaining that they don't work for him. That is a true story, by the way. I keep offering to send Schoolhouse Rock videos up there, but so yeah, it's not that Congress wasn't prepared, it's that the White House wasn't prepared to do what a president does, which is to take their victory, to take their honeymoon, and push forward, 5 or 6 agenda items that they care a lot about. Didn't happen this time.
And the other thing is President Trump was unique that he came into office with a very low approval rating. He didn't have the traditional bump that most presidents get. So he didn't have a honeymoon, and I don't think congressional Republicans felt he had a mandate.
To your question about whether or not the congressional Republicans were prepared for any kind of a Republican win, I think that begs the question of could any other Republican have won in that environment? Trump was a different kind of candidate, and I think if you think about our last 2 presidents, they were both people with strong personalities, with a real authenticity, whether you like them or not. And in a world where news is reality TV, 24 hours a day, sensationalized, those are the types of candidates that we're going to have for high-level offices. And so I think that's the reality we're dealing with. And whether or not I think it's correct, obviously, people were just bumping into each other, trying to figure out what to do next, whether that was in the halls of Congress or in the administration. But the reality is, whether or not he had a mandate or whether or not he had high approval ratings, he was still able to get a significant tax package done and continue to engage the people that helped him put together that winning coalition to be able to get some things done across in Congress. And the fallout politically was bad in the special elections. It was bad in the most recent elections, but not catastrophic, especially if you compare it to the midterms for President Obama.
Going back to were they prepared? Look, I think, and Jessica mentioned the tax package. Look, this is the fact that they passed a tax package that they somehow lost on. Republicans, this is one of the things that when you ask voters who do you trust more, it's a pretty common knowledge that voters by and large trust Republicans more than Democrats. There's a reason why Bannon leaked out the memo at the end of the last cycle about how they really screwed the tax package. We won the Pennsylvania 18 special. They tried to take a victory lap against Connor Lamb on the tax package they just passed. And they did it by cutting Social Security and Medicare. And when we ran on that, we actually figured out that we were going to win on taxes. If they would have done taxes in a way, when Bannon, look, say what you want about Bannon, there's a lot we could talk about how terrible of a human he is, in my opinion. But the reality is he is a true, he's a true populist at heart, and the tax package that he wanted passed was not reflected by the one that ultimately was passed when 83% of it went to the top 1% of the country. So when when you have the bully pulpit and your two biggest reforms are going to be healthcare, which you're the dog who finally caught the car and didn't know how to pass it, and then taxes that you pass that is somehow unpopular, tax cuts. No, I think whether it was policy failure from the White House or policy failure from the congressional leaders, they weren't ready no matter. I don't think they might not have been ready no matter who it was at this point.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question to some of the folks, the Washington folks, that it struck me that Trump had an opportunity right off the bat, similar to how Obama did at the beginning of his first term, to have gotten a lot of things done cross-partisan, but didn't take that opportunity. And could they have, had Trump gone after an infrastructure bill right out of the chutes and brought people together for the good of the country instead of going right to health care, would we be talking about a different midterm?
A lot of Republicans think infrastructure would have helped them in this election. I mean, that healthcare vote that they took really gave you guys this election. It gave just so much fodder for Democrats, whereas in infrastructure, a bipartisan bill, there was a real sense in the beginning, Trump and Schumer have known each other for a long time, Chuck and Nancy, as Trump called them, they seem to sort of have this, at least like each other on a personal level, and had they done something that would have been mutually beneficial, Republicans think that could have saved them, or at least helped them pad their losses.
Okay, I think Eliza referenced a few minutes ago one of the special elections. One of the questions I was going to pose to all of you is, were there any special elections that you saw in 17 or 18 that you thought were particularly significant in terms of what the 18 results would be?
I thought the Pennsylvania 18 special election was hugely significant for a number of reasons. Of course, I'm sure everyone remembers, but that was, of course, a seat in Western Pennsylvania was vacated by a Republican who had to step aside in scandal. And it was a very conservative district, and Trump had won it by nearly 20 percentage points. But ultimately, Democrats were able to take it back with the candidate of Connor Lamb, who really ran as a moderate, centrist Democrat, Marine veteran, someone who's very careful about how he talked about sort of cultural wedge issues like guns, and he was successful. And I think part of the reason that district it was viewed by many Republicans as really significant was because it offered a template for a lot of Democratic candidates who really fell into a similar mold as Lamb did. They really tried to sound moderate. Many of them were military veterans or CIA veterans. They, like him, were more open about their willingness to break with Democratic leadership in Washington, including with Nancy Pelosi. And so that really offered a jolt of energy and kind of a model for a lot of these candidates running across the country. And then I know certainly Democrats, as Jason was mentioning, thought that it offered sort of a model on how to respond to the tax bill, which Republicans had thought was going to be extraordinarily helpful for them. And you talk to a lot of Republicans who think that they had to get it done. They think that was helpful for them in some places, but Democrats would point to PA 18 and say that offered the template for how to run against it, even in a conservative district.
Look, I think the Katie mentioned Pennsylvania 18. But Ohio 12 too. The reality was we lost Ohio 12 by 900 votes. We won Pennsylvania 18 by 500 votes. They're effectively the same exact result, right? In a blind world, one's a winner and one's a loser. But one of the things that we saw, we did post-focus groups in both of those things. And one of the things that we saw, especially in Pennsylvania 18, when Connor Lamb, as Katie mentioned, he was he was a U.S. attorney, a JAG officer, who kind of fit the profile of a lot of our candidates this cycle. And when we did a post-election focus group 5 days after the election, we played back all the ads that the NRCC and Congressional Leadership Fund, which is Paul Ryan's super PAC, ran against Connor Lamb, and the voters found them insulting. And these were all voters. It was a pool of all Trump and Connor Lamb voters. So these are people who voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential, and then voted for Connor Lamb in the special. And they thought for a guy who obviously served his country, calling him, there was an ad that called him Pelosi's lamb. It was basically him dressed up as a cartoon in a lamb costume and put his head on top of it. And they found it insulting. And we felt pretty darn good after that, given what we had. And in Ohio 12, again, they tried to hit Danny O'Connor. This is Columbus suburbs, but deep into some of the rural parts of Ohio as well too. He was a fresh face, as so many of our candidates were this cycle, young and not a long voting record, which was very helpful. And there wasn't much to hang around him, so they just hung national stuff around him. But when you have authentic candidates running on local issues that are able to localize a race, even in very tough districts, this was a seat Donald Trump won by 12 points, and a seat no Democrat had won since the 2006 gubernatorial wave when we won statewide by like 24 points. Nobody had won there since, and the fact that we came within 500 votes, we felt probably as good as we did almost winning that one than we did winning the Pennsylvania 18 race, just because the Republican in the Pennsylvania 18 race was so terrible, and Connor was just, Connor was pretty darn good, and this one was it was in the middle of the summer and not given as much attention, so not as all much money came into the race. And the fact that we were able to come in that close in that kind of a district made us feel like we were going to be a really good night on November 7th.
I tend to think these midterm elections, they're the only show in town when they happen. So we spend too much money on them. We overanalyze them too much, both the political pundits and the operatives as well as the media. And they're vetted a lot more than a normal congressional race would be, right? Like they're vetted like they're running for the Senate or the presidency, because everybody's looking for that to be some kind of indicator going forward. I think it was an indicator, obviously, because you had Democrats winning some Republican districts. I think the big takeaway for the Republican Party in some of these special elections was the quality of your candidate actually matters. and making sure that we, in some times of those special elections, that it does matter that you have someone that can progress in a general election.
And that makes me think of the Doug Jones and Roy Moore race. When we talk about quality candidates, and I think that race stands out in my mind simply because you were able to see kind of a blueprint for how to mobilize communities of color and other voter constituencies that ended up leading to the historic win in the South, in a place we would have never thought a Democratic candidate would win that type of race. But it was also insightful to see that it was such a challenge to get that win when you look at a candidate who had been, essentially, I don't want to say charged with, but accused of different issues with molestation in young girls coming on the heels of the Me Too movement, right? There was still a fight. And so that, even in itself, brought me back to the 2016 presidential campaign where you had a presidential candidate who was also accused of sexual harassment and inappropriate behavior, but still managed to win the presidency in a large swath of Republican voters. So I think on the one hand, we saw a model and blueprint for how to win difficult races in regions where we're not supposed to win, but we also, is there a rise of hyper-partisanship in which, voters are now loyal to candidates regardless of the controversies and the issues that they have as candidates, and showing loyalty to the party? Like, what does that really mean and look like? And then how do you campaign as an operative against candidates like that? And what does that look like?
When the Ossoff race in Georgia took place, that special, the consistent specials through Ohio, Pennsylvania, you saw consistently Democrats outperforming the average Democratic performance, right? Turning out at 20+%, high teens, whatever it may be. And that, for those of us who weren't directly involved on a congressional race, was very heartening because you would see that in the state Senate, you would see it at local races. But one of the things also was that for the first time this cycle, we had the means and the ability to put money into these races that wasn't just, it was grassroots money. Email fundraising raised millions of dollars for Ossoff. It raised millions of dollars for many of these races, and that benefited, I don't know if the Dietrich worked in conjunction with them, but I know it benefited a lot of other organizations who were raising money for those races and building a list of national donors, grassroots donors across the country who were willing to support candidates that weren't in their backyard. I gave to, I gave to support the race in Georgia, right? I live in Chicago. The ability to do that was present, but not as ubiquitous as it had been before this cycle. And I think that allowed us to do a lot more and play a lot more.
And add off the Ossoff race in Georgia, that race did ultimately get won by a Republican in the special and then flipped in November. But the first thing, a big thing I noticed when I was down there was that was the beginning, in my view, of looking at the suburban woman showing up for Democrats. I went door knocking with these women who said they felt guilty that they had not done enough for Hillary Clinton. And so they were door knocking for Ossoff. It was so hot and so muggy, and they were spending hours and hours because of guilt. And they were Democrats, but they'd never put yard signs up, they had never been vocal, they had never told their friends, and now they were. And we saw that theme translate through the rest of the election as well.
Okay, one of the limitations in a post-election conference that focuses on midterm elections is that you have hundreds of midterms. So we can't really get into all of those individual races, which really are similar in many ways, but also very unique in many ways. But one of the things I wanted to do is kind of highlight some of those. So I'd like to start with Jennifer on this. And Jennifer, could you kind of run through how the Cook report saw the Senate at the beginning of the cycle, and then going into 2018, maybe highlight a few of what you thought were the most critical U.S. Senate races?
Sure. When we did ratings, which we did in December of 2016, and we rate races on a 7-point scale from solid Democrat likely lean toss-up all the way to solid Republican. We have a couple of rules, is that unless you have an announced first-tier opponent, nobody starts in toss-up. The most vulnerable races were sitting in the lean column. But when we looked at this particular class, there were a couple of things that stood out. On the one hand, Democrats were defending more seats. Ultimately, they were defending 26. They had 10 seats in states that Trump carried in 16. Now, 5 of those seats he carried by 6 points or less, but another 5 he carried by 19 points or more. So that was a vulnerability. On the other hand, we also recognized that it was a midterm election, that there were a lot of angry voters about the outcome, especially women. And we did recognize that while Republicans were only defending ultimately 9 seats, that they had a couple of real soft spots. The other thing we didn't know is who's going to retire. How much was that going to change the landscape? So I went back at Bill's request. I looked at those first ratings, and the one thing that stood out to me is that if I put you in solid Democrat, you won the lottery because nobody moved out of that column, and only one other seat moved into it. But the races that we thought were going to be competitive were in fact competitive. And that is the top 5 races in states that Trump won by more than 19 points. So West Virginia, North Dakota, Missouri, Indiana. Florida was a little bit of an outlier. At the end of the cycle, we also had New Jersey in play. But I think New Jersey would have been, it had nothing to do with anything but, an incumbent senator who had a lot of ethics problems, shall we say, but still managed to win. It's New Jersey. The bar's a little lower there. And then when I looked at the Republican side of the aisle, there was where we had a couple of surprises. So we always knew from day one that Nevada was going to be very competitive. Hillary Clinton carried that state by 4 points. And you had an incumbent who is viewed as something of a moderate. What that means in the Republican Party is that the right hammers you every day, and Democrats hammer you every day, and you've got no place to go but sort of pounded into the ground, which is exactly what happened to Dean Heller. And then, Jeff Flake in Arizona announced he was going to retire, and that put that race in a totally different light. Then you had one other retirement in a state that I would not have guessed was going to be competitive, and that was Tennessee. That was actually a pretty close race all the way through because Democrats recruited a terrific candidate and former Governor Phil Bredesen. And then the one that I'm still sporting some bruises on was that we saw Texas finally as competitive. Now, what's a little bit different about what I do as opposed to what Eliza and Katie do is that I don't need to tell you everything I know about a race. So I get to have some very candid conversations with operatives and pollsters, and I can make a decision based on that. And so what I was learning in Texas told me that this was a considerably closer race than anybody had thought. So that ended up in toss-up. As it played out, I can say that Republicans had some recruiting failures that I think cost them some opportunities. Ohio, Sherrod Brown, Pennsylvania, Bob Casey, Michigan, Debbie Stabenow. But a lot of first-tier candidates, Republicans anyway, looked at the cycle and said, this is not going to be a great cycle for us. It's a midterm election and we just won the White House. And they sort of stood down. So I think that the playing field was not as big as a lot of people expected it to be. But at the end of the day, when I looked at the final results and the final ratings, There weren't a lot of surprises there. I think maybe the thing that surprised me most was in Tennessee, the Republican Marsha Blackburn actually won that race by 11 points. I would not have thought her margin was going to be that strong. But people say, well, where were the sleeper races? What people need to understand about my job is I'm not supposed to be surprised by anything. So it's there aren't a lot of sleepers out there. So at the end of the day, pretty much states behaved like their red, blue, purple designations expected them to behave. So my sort of tagline the day after the election was, geography was indeed destiny. Even Arizona is not a red state anymore. That is a purple state. I mean, Trump only won that state by 4 points. So it's going to be, I think that it makes it interesting for 2020, both Senate and presidentially, but it pretty much played out the way it should have. I am a little dismissive of people who thought that Republicans should have had a better night. No, not in a midterm year when they controlled all the levers. That they got to +2 was, I think, the best they were going to do. I mean, there was a point early in 2018 where my best outcome for them was a tied Senate. Wow. Yeah, that was my best outcome for them, was a tied Senate.
When was that? At what point do you remember legislatively what was happening?
It didn't have to do with legislation per se. It had to do with candidates and how they were running their campaigns. That, like in West Virginia, that Patrick Morrisey was proving to be a weak candidate. They worried a lot about Josh Hawley in Missouri, that he wasn't raising the money he needed to raise to run a competent race. There was just a lot of concern out there about the kind of campaigns Republicans were running that were not going to be able to take advantage of the opportunities in the places they existed.
What did some of the rest of you see about specific Senate races that you found interesting? We have a few minutes to discuss this.
I mean, what, specific races out there?
Well, I'm asking if anybody else has any comments they would like to offer about specific races.
I mean, the main thing I looked at based on the exit polls was if you could tell me what Trump's approval rating would be, I could peg the Republican vote within a couple points, except in outliers like West Virginia or Ohio. So the Senate really, the candidates who beat the Democratic senators, they beat them because Trump's approval was high enough in states like Missouri and North Dakota. That's how those candidates won.
Okay.
My firm did Ted Cruz's race. Our firm founder and president is Jeff Rowe, and he also ran his presidential race. And obviously that race has been dissected and pulled apart and turned upside down even before it was over. And Jeff has spoken about what a tough candidate he thinks that O'Rourke would be in Iowa in fewer days than I'd like to think about. And certainly that was a race where, with a Democrat candidate, I think it was a bit of a cult of personality, like we see, and also, as you said, an evidence of how we nationalize some of these state races when you have a personality like that. I think if you look at the turnout, I think that race was less about President Trump, and I think you saw a lot more turnout if you want to analyze it from a geographic standpoint. Obviously, the urban areas, suburban areas had much higher turnout than they had previously, and largely Democrat. But the Cruz campaign was cognizant of that and made sure that they increased their turnout, not by necessarily the same margin, but in those more rural conservative districts. And I actually think that race would have been closer had the election been held like 10 days earlier. If you think about what happened in the last 10 days of the election, I think you had races that flipped in the last 10 days. We don't always think about that. We want it to be, nice and neat, and this was a referendum on Trump. or Obama or whoever's in the White House at the midterm election. But we had some pretty significant things happen when you think about the bombs that were sent to elected officials and media personalities. And you think about the synagogue shootings. And then you had the president come out and talk about birthright citizenship, which I think a lot of people maybe think he shoots from the hip. I actually think he was probably trying to change the conversation away from gun control, but it wasn't a topic that was particularly helpful in close districts. So, but I think ultimately, and you know, there's some talk about Senator Cruz underperformed Governor Abbott, but I think that when I don't think you can compare governors and senators. I have worked for Governor Ricketts in Nebraska for the last 4 years, and I'm always surprised. They're just in the news so much, and they're in the community so much, and it's not the same. They develop their own brand. They're still branded with their party, but they have their own brand. People know them every day, even in larger states like Texas. So, you know, I think the Cruz race, I mean, he was outspent. I think O'Rourke still has something ridiculous, like $70 million. Is that right? It should be scary to anyone, but any Republican, I suppose. But I think, you know, it was a model of, in a bad year, you know, how do you energize your voters so that you increase your percentage turnout in the favorable areas, and their campaign did a very good job of that.
Another interesting Senate race, of course, is the McCaskill and Holly race. I work in both Kansas and Missouri and was working with a couple of entities, Black PAC out of Washington, D.C., to get out the black vote in the state of Missouri and the minimum wage ballot proposition to get that passed in Missouri. And that race was interesting from the beginning. McCaskill, as the incumbent, had a difficult race prior to, but managed to pull it out because of controversial comments by her opponent, which meant that he lost the race. And maybe today, having made the same comments, who knows that would be the case, the way Republicans are winning despite controversies. And so it was a race that was always neck and neck. I think it was up until the Kavanaugh hearings that you started to see Claire kind of fall behind in the polling and in the numbers. And it took a moment for her to come out and say that she would vote no on Kavanaugh. And when she came out and said she would vote no, she gave reasons that did not speak to the issue, again, of the allegations of sexual harassment. And so I think for her, that hurt her with rural voters that she needed to get in outlying areas of Missouri, but it also hurt her with the base, because I think they wanted to see, women Democratic voters wanted to see a stronger condemnation of his actions and her vote being related to that. And so I think that made it difficult for her to win. You saw an uptick in Republican voters across the state of Missouri. Even in 2016, Republicans outvoted Democrats, but we saw larger Republican numbers in this race. And in Missouri, not only do we have a Senate race and a statewide seat up for election, we had 3 different ballot initiatives. We had the minimum wage ballot initiative, we had medical marijuana on the ballot, and we also had a campaign finance reform type amendment up to the vote for voters. And despite Claire losing, all of those initiatives passed, and they passed overwhelmingly. They passed with the help of rural Republican voters. So there's this rise of the Republican voter who will vote for marijuana, who will vote for a raise in minimum wage, and who will vote for campaign finance reform, but would not vote for the Senate candidate who would be likely to support those issues if they were to come across their desk. So I think we've gone from, you know, what's the matter with Kansas to what's the matter with Missouri, right? Like, what is going on in Missouri that those are the results? And then, you know, Claire was very early out criticized for her engagement of black voters. And black voters in 16, 17, and 18 have proven time and time again to be a very pivotal voting bloc. And so for an incumbent Democratic candidate to have those issues with a constituency that is necessary in a fight in a race where every single vote is going to count and you have to get every single vote you can, I think that hurt her. Now, Black voters came out in the numbers that they needed to. I think Black PAC, there was a voter registration effort of upwards 90,000, new voters on the rolls. There was a GOTV effort that was unprecedented, and Black voters came out in strong numbers. But in a race where every single vote counts, you have to work to expand the base just as much as you work to bring out those moderate Republicans in rural areas. So I think her race is that was just interesting. It'll be interesting to dissect it and see what can be learned so that the party in Missouri does a better job of engaging voters for 2020 if you at least want to shore off major wins on the Republican side, and what it could mean for like states across the country.
Okay, I'd like to move to a kind of a macro level discussion of the House races, and I'm going to start by asking Jason Bresler from the DCCC to walk us through kind of the assumptions that you made at the beginning of the cycle and the strategy that was basically adapted and kind of what worked and what didn't, Jason.
For sure. Like I mentioned before, we tapped into the enthusiasm very early on, right after the marches, and we knew that was going to be key. But then one of the first things we did, we identified 59 seats that we thought were going to be our initial targets. And these, and we got a lot of second guessing from this list. This list eventually grew to 111, and I'll go into the strategy of why we needed such a big battlefield a little bit longer. But of those 59 seats we initially identified, we're going to be at 40 or 41, and it's either, of those first 59, 37 or 38, depending on what happens in North Carolina, are going to be on those initial 59. But we also knew we had to go far and wide, just because of natural redistricting, of some of the pains that the Democrats were still suffering from post-2010. We knew that at the end of the day, the only way to overcome the initial just barometer of sort of our inequities we have in redistricting, we had to go far and wide and spread out what we thought was going to be a really huge Republican money advantage early on. And look, what we saw, one of the things that we saw very early on, the difference between 2010 and the candidates that came forward in the Republican primaries, and 2018 with some of the people that came forward to run, and also the voters in Democratic primaries. In 2010, now I'm a Democrat, but I like to clarify the people who ran in 2010 and who won their primaries as people who just wanted to burn the whole system down. The Tea Party was literally effectively wanted to burn everything down in D.C. And in 2018, the candidates running and stepping forward to run, and the candidates that voters elected to win primaries, were people willing to run into the fire and save the establishment. I think we saw that across the country. We saw it in CIA operatives across the country. We saw it in veterans across the country, and people who you didn't need to run super far to the left to win primaries because Donald Trump scares a lot of Democrats and unifies a lot of them, and voters wanted to make sure whoever they voted for was going to win and win the House. So we were very nervous early on in some of our earliest states. We had there was a primary in Texas in March that we weighed into because there was a candidate we were a little bit afraid of winning the primary, and she ultimately didn't, but we caught a lot of heat for it. But by and large, we didn't have to get involved in too many primaries in a very heavy-handed way. We did name people on our red to blue list, which is our de facto endorsement in some cases before their primary. But we wanted to make sure that we, or at least the Democrats had a viable candidate at the end of the table, no matter what. And one of the big differences too, people ask me all the time throughout the entire cycle to compare 2006 to 2018. One of the major differences that we saw very early on, in 2006, even Republicans were done with Bush. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but his approval ratings amongst Republicans was still in the low 70s to mid 70s. Trump's was in the low 90s or high 80s throughout the entire duration. We never thought for a second that Republicans weren't going to show up to vote in this midterm, and I think we saw it. And especially, look, we were able to, we were talking backstage beforehand. If there's a readjustment, a grand readjustment of the parties, I don't know. But the reality is, we had won. We knew that in the suburban districts with higher educated voters, those were coming to us very, very quickly. But in places where Trump saw his surge in rural Ohio and certainly in parts of Missouri that made it a much more red state, those people were going to show up to vote, and we saw it in specials. Look, and one of the crazy things about Georgia 6, and Jessica made a really good point, because we do overanalyze these specials sometimes to ad nauseum effects. And I mean, look, the Georgia 6 special, it was $25 million was spent on behalf of John Ossoff. And the reality was he got more votes in the special than President Obama did in 2012 in the general election, and still fell up short, because at the end of the day, you know, it was a week after the shooting happened at the congressional softball game, and you know, Republicans were turned out to vote, and they were there. So we knew very early on that, taking for granted just because our base was fired up, that their base was going to be not going to be fired up, we knew we didn't have a shot. We knew that wasn't going to happen. So look, we got to eventually 111 targets, and in 2016, we Democrats, we lost the White House, but we still picked up 6 House seats. The DCCC only spent in 40 different seats and picked up 6. This cycle, we spent in over 85 seats and picked up either 40 or 41. And again, that goes to the matter. We had to spread them out as far and wide as we possibly could. We had to get as many campaigns viable as we possibly could get viable. We knew, you know, there was folks coming out that were going to spend, when Sheldon Adelstein can write $20 million, when things like that, we did not count it. Michael Bloomberg ended up spending $80 million close to $80 million on behalf of Democrats. That was not something we factor on happening. And I think Kelly mentioned earlier, the grassroots money this cycle was something that we've never seen before. I've talked to some other Republican operatives and consultants post this last cycle, and every time, you know, every week, you know, we look at competitives, which is it's basically your how much TV time you and your opponent are buying. And obviously, there's a lot of other communication forms we do, but it's the easiest apples-to-apples comparison to see what's happening in terms of the money and what's following. And the Republican operatives would talk about how every time they lay down a buy, and we'd come back in and go up at 150% of what they laid down. It's just something that doesn't usually happen in Democratic campaigns, especially at the House level. And the enthusiasm that we had, not only from low dollar donors, but even high dollar donors by and large, where there were programs where, you know, there were candidates and big dollar donors that were putting together these programs that as soon as candidates won primaries, Swing Left, which is a low dollar donor organization, was getting you $300,000 in victory funds for some of these candidates. There's other things called the Victory Project, where high dollar donors from, you know, New York and Chicago, you'd also get another $350,000 on top of that too. Which again, this is monopoly money for Democratic House campaigns, right? I mean, there was House campaigns that got to $30 million that weren't special elections this cycle. And that's just something we've never, ever been a part of. And it was, but you know, we had to build again far and wide. And one of the things we got to early on too, we built this thing called an expansion department at the DCCC this cycle. And basically it was to take these candidates who were good on paper in tough districts, make them viable, and make Republicans spend. And when we knew we won the House, ironically enough, we ended up winning the seat, but when we knew we won the House is when Republicans had to go into South Carolina 1 to try and save this seat. This was a seat that many folks remember. There was a special here in 2015. The former governor won despite, you know, a sex scandal that he went on a hike for in the woods. And you know, the fact that Republicans were trying to save this seat on week 2, we knew our plan had worked. The fact that they had to spend $2 million in Washington 3, again, a +10 Trump district, in week 2, we knew our plan had worked. And you know, we knew we had to spread, and then once that happened, that's when you get to the point where if you win by 8%, and a lot of things are going to come forward, when you win by 8% nationally, you get a lot more than the 24, 25, 26 seat you're supposed to get, because we spread them out as far and wide and thin as we possibly can. And then last, and I think it's been mentioned before, but the candidate quality this time around, you know, the people that stepped up to run for Congress across the board was especially obviously great for us. But Republicans had a very tough time recruiting people to run for Congress. In thinking of, you know, of Congressman Dent's seat in Pennsylvania, this was a seat that got redistricted, but was still a 50.1 Hillary district and a 49.9 Trump district. The candidate that no candidate on the Republican side really wanted to run. There was a couple of halfway decent guys that ran. The guy that got through was plagued with sexual scandals, couldn't raise any money, and Republicans were throwing him under the bus publicly and behind closed doors very early on. And you know, that's sort of the challenges that they had this cycle, but also some of the advantages we had this cycle of people who were willing to step up to run.
Okay, I'm going to ask the rest of you if you have any comments about House strategy, but I want to point out first that John Rogers who's the executive director of the National Republican Congressional Committee, was going to be with us, but had to cancel out at the last minute. If you've seen the stories on Politico about a big hack on NRCC emails, I suspect that's the reason, but I did want to reference that he was going to join us. But what do some of the rest of you think about the respective strategies of the two parties going into this cycle in the House campaigns?
Candidate quality has come up a couple of times, and I would note that there were a lot of Republican incumbents that, certainly Republicans and also some Democrats acknowledged, appeared to be very strong candidates. These were battle-tested candidates. In fact, going into this cycle, I believe that there had been 23 districts that Hillary Clinton had won that were also held by Republicans. And the thinking from a lot of Republicans was, these members are the most battle-tested. They are the best fits for the district. They know the district. They have strong brands, strong name ID, and so they're going to be able to weather a storm. And we were talking about this also backstage. Only 3 of them actually ended up surviving. And, that does speak to this broader dynamic that I think that we saw play out this cycle, and perhaps you see it frequently in other midterm cycles as well. But, this question of can strong personal brand trump a tough environment? And this time around, that was a real challenge, even for some candidates in districts that no one until, pretty late in the game had expected to be competitive.
I think that could be said for the Yoder-Davids race, right? I don't know that anyone thought initially that Sharice Davids would give Yoder a run for his money, much less win, in a place that is a highly Republican district, and he is, for the most part, had served well with, very little controversy and very little. I mean, there's some, but compared to Republican candidates that you see now.
Do we need to talk about the Dead Sea, or should we just let that go?
I mean, when you've got candidates who are, accused of molesting children, the Dead Sea then becomes like, the thing that you just kind of brush off to the side, right? So I would say that the Yoder Sharice Davids race was very much that. I think we're still in a climate of anti-establishment on some level, and that has helped candidates like Sharice Davids rise to the forefront and rise to levels that we would not have expected. And it'll be interesting to see how these leaders who have now beat these battle-tested Republicans, how they lead and what that means going forward.
I think we should also talk about the message in the national environment as well. Democrats, and I think this was a brilliant strategy if it was intentional or not, but if you run as a Democrat, definitely intentional, absolutely. Nice. If you're a Democrat, people know you don't like Trump, right? Democrats at the House level, for the most part, did not run specifically against Trump. Their ads were about health care. They were about issues that mattered, to your point, being authentic, right? And one of the things that I believe Republicans do better sometimes than Democrats is standing up and being passionate and not worrying about being all things to all people, but this is what I believe. This is what I care about. If you want that to happen, elect me. If you don't, then vote for someone else. And we had a lot more candidates this time, I believe, who were willing and could communicate like that. And it wasn't throw Trump out, it was we need to protect health care. We need to bread and butter issues that mattered to voters. The national environment was already out there. The fear and hate are very motivating factors when you use emotion to get people to vote. I think some of that backfired on the Trump message to motivate specifically suburban women, African American women, and others to come out after seeing what had happened since 16.
Yeah, look, all joking aside, it was, when you have a president who commands more, who could change the news cycle every single day with a tweet, us playing in and everybody sees his tweets, us waiting in and spending money when we have the kind of candidates we're running, seemed like a really stupid thing for us to do, and we hardly spent, with very few exceptions, I think we probably spent some money in California, but with very few exceptions did we bring Trump into any race. And there was one suburban Chicago seat we did as well for the Peter Roskam seat, but very, very rarely do we ever bring Trump into any of the equation, because exactly to Kelly's point, the guy's on television or on his Twitter and changes the world, and bringing him in when people see him and they're constantly in his face seemed like a wasted amount of, not only bad strategy, but a wasted amount of resources that we're never going to get back. In a day and age where communication, no matter what it is, and there's a whole bunch of, theories on the best ways to do it, but regardless, it's getting more and more thin, and whether it's on digital or television, to communicate with voters is getting harder and harder and harder, despite the fact that more and more is being spent on doing it.
I was going to say that's particularly a good case. The way that you guys approached, I think, was helpful with the nonpartisan independent voters, that they were attracted very much to taking the tone down and not making this, even though it was going to be a referendum on Trump, you don't have to throw it in their face, because they're attracted to those key issues that you guys ran on, which I think was really smart.
Okay, any other comments on House races?
You know, I think the interesting thing on the House races is you had, and we've talked a little bit about, you won House races, the Democrats won House races in districts that had voted for Trump previously. We've talked a little bit about the suburbs going more strongly for Democrats. I think the interesting thing in the next race will be whether or not those seats will flip back after you see some votes in the House on the Democrat agenda. Because I think you do have some members that you elected that are have more of a resistance flavor than a moderate Democrat flavor. And so I think what the Speaker is going to have to deal with, and I never underestimate Nancy Pelosi. She's obviously very shrewd and smart about everything she does. But I mean, does she want to entertain a vote on impeachment? And if not, then she probably has to entertain a lot of votes on some of these issues that maybe don't sell as well in those upper middle class, I think I've heard them called Whole Foods areas, which I think kind of describes them well. So if they're voting on $15 minimum wage, if they're voting on, Medicaid for all, if they're voting on free college education in these more affluent areas, and these people are cognizant of the fact that we already have more than 40% of people in the country who aren't paying the federal income tax, do those areas ultimately flip back because the agenda in the House isn't really in their best interests?
And right off the bat, starting in January, we'll see a lot of these Democrats pledge to not vote for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker. Some did vote against her behind closed doors. We'll see what they do on the floor, but that's going to be a first vote, and it's not totally clear if their constituents will remember that in 2020, but it does put them in an awkward position to make that be their first vote.
And we're going to visit that issue a little bit more in depth tomorrow, but right now what I'd like to do is take a brief break. We will reconvene in about 11 minutes at 3:45. I'm going to ask everyone to please make sure that you're in your seats by then. Thank you. Material here in the next 40 minutes and conclude around 4:30. I want to start our second discussion this afternoon, go back to the races and ask Jim Jonas, who is our spring fellow, who did a fascinating study group on independent candidacies and the desire for independent candidacies, to speak briefly about some of the highlight independent candidacies this year, but especially some of the ballot initiatives that people may not be aware of. Jim?
Thanks, Bill. I wish there were more great stories to talk about with independent candidates nationally. Just as a little background on my history, in 2014, I was the campaign manager for Greg Orman, who ran for U.S. Senate here in Kansas. And coming out of that race, we had a lot of momentum, and we were able to raise a significant amount of money, and we were able to go recruit a number of people over the last 4 years to run as independents and try to challenge the duopoly, and ultimately thinking that we got to get our system back on track, that the electoral system is broken, and candidates is one piece of how we start addressing the problem with broken politics. So we did a good job of recruiting a number of candidates across the country, particularly in state legislative races. We were able to attract a number of good candidates. So we were doing it both top-down and bottom-up of trying to find legislative candidates who could be competitive. but also some signature races on the national level that could be ones we could use as beacons to really drive more behavior. The problem that we ran into is that we've become so tribal over the last couple of cycles and so divisive in our national politics that it's really, really, really hard for third-party or independent candidates to find any oxygen in three-way races. Now, in two-way races, you got a good chance. You can assume that there's going to be an anti to whomever you're running against. But in a three-way race, political scientists, political sci students, and any professors in the room, Duverger's law says that it's really, really difficult for, in the plurality voting system that we have, for a third party or an independent candidate to crack through. That didn't stop us from trying, but we didn't really not have a whole lot of great examples to show of progress this cycle. However, those of us who are in this space and do a lot of work in it, we understand that there are some huge, huge barriers for what we're doing and how to become competitive. And you're not going to be able to do it as long as you have plurality voting systems in most of these places. And also, it may be just as important, it's really difficult to identify what it means to be an independent. That it is not just this cohesive block of people that are independents and they believe in these certain sets of values. There's lots of independents and they run from across the political spectrum. So it's dangerous ground when you start saying there's three voting blocks, there's Republican, there's Democrat, and there's Independent. It just doesn't exist that way. So a lot of us in this space are focused on ways that we can start taking cracks to the dam and plurality voting, and ways that we can make it more competitive for third-party and independent candidates in the future to be more competitive. And I think it's one of the big unreported stories of this cycle. Certainly, you got to talk about red team and blue team and how they did with each other, but voters across the country were really looking at the system being broken and being angry at a partisan political system that they just don't feel is appropriate for solving problems. So while I think Democrats could claim victory from a seat perspective, Americans can claim victory for democracy in a lot of ways, that we showed some remarkable wins. I just had a few of these. In a lot of ways not reported. Ethics reform initiatives were passed in New Mexico, Missouri, North Dakota, and Florida. Money and politics reform passed in Missouri, North Dakota, Baltimore, New York City, Denver, Phoenix, and Massachusetts. Redistricting reform passed in Michigan, Colorado, Missouri, and Utah, and there's more coming. And then voting rights passed in Florida, Maryland, Michigan, Nevada, and lots of other places. And the big one that I'd want to point out is ranked choice voting that passed or was supported, held in Maine, that you guys are still fighting that one. It's going to be a battle. But there's a lot of money and a lot of momentum, a lot of energy going into ranked choice voting and changing the system so that we get away from this right-left construct and get more into the away from plurality voting and more into majority voting, which is what a ranked choice voting system will get. So it was supported in Maine. There are a good number of groups, I was with them last week, that are coming together, consolidating energy and focus, and you're going to see it on the ballot in a lot of different states in 2020, 2022. So I think it'll be really interesting to watch when we come back for the next one of these, in a ranked choice voting system, what that means for the makeup of the elected officials.
Okay, I want to go into, I think, 3 macro level issues and kind of explore how much impact they had on the results this year. So let's start with the Mueller investigation. Does anybody believe that that had an impact, and what was it in terms of the election results?
You mean the witch hunt?
Those are your words, Kelly, not mine.
I, Kelly Dietrich, said witch hunt, yes.
Yes.
I mean, mean, just talking about, we asked on the exit polls, is the Russia investigation justified or politically motivated? And in that, only 41% said justified, 54% said politically motivated. Then we also asked an approval of Robert Mueller's investigation, and he got a 41% approval and 46% disapproval. So there is some evidence in the exit polls that voters are not, don't necessarily discount the witch hunt.
I don't know, I think Mueller's a base motivator for both sides. I saw Democrats use it a lot to raise money. I saw Republicans use it a lot to raise money. But on the stump, I did not hear about it. I did not see it in a single ad I watched. And just for the record, I watched 3,800 ads.
Do you have like a board next to you where you?
Hey, Jennifer, don't you have a more specific number than 3,800? I mean, 3841 or something?
There's a really good article that Alexandria Petrie just wrote in the Washington Post, and it looks like what happens when Mueller does reveal everything he did, right? The people who believe it was justified are going to think his findings are real, and the people who don't are not going to believe it. Right. And I don't think that anything is going to change much in terms of public perception. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I think people have, to Jim's point earlier, the country is running, Donald Trump is very good at making people run to their corners. And I don't think it's going to change. I could be wrong, but I don't think it's going to change much. I don't think it had changed much now. I don't think when its findings come out, it's going to change much either, because I think people are going to believe it or they're not. And I don't think anybody's going to change their mind over what he reveals. I mean, I could be wrong, but that's I firmly believe in that.
I think it would have made a bigger impact had Robert Mueller been removed. I think the fact that he was still there was good.
The smart operatives on this panel can correct me if this is wrong for sure, but I did not see or hear much evidence that it was determinative in a lot of these races. On one side, certainly it added, for Democrats and some Republicans who were uneasy with Trump, it was another data point that made them more uneasy. And on the other side, you certainly did have Republicans in an effort to energize their base, raise the specter of impeachment, and certainly the investigations are part of that. They would point to, the prospect of a Democratic Congress that could, building on this potential, the potential results of this investigation, launch all kinds of their own investigations, and I think we probably will see some investigations, but you would see impeachment a little bit more as a talking point, but not necessarily the kind of nitty-gritty, and it's of course such a complicated issue, and one that seems to grow more complicated by the day, so it didn't seem like that was sort of a defining issue, although, depending on what news he makes, I guess we'll see next time.
I will say one Russia-related thing that did hurt Republican operative told me that their lowest polling of the whole year was after the Helsinki press conference. Mm-hmm. They did feel that had a very negative effect. I know that's not Mueller, but that was sort of, Republicans were unhappy with that moment, and obviously Democrats were, of course, very unhappy. I don't know if your guys' polling mirrored theirs, but.
Look, he was so elastic everywhere throughout the. I mean, he would go down. His favorability would go down 5 or 6, and then it would come back up within a week. It just, the Helsinki point was interesting. It was certainly the one time that we thought, there could be some reasoning to go that angle, but again, it evaporated pretty quickly after that.
And that also came around the same time as family separations. Mm-hmm. So some of that could have been mixed together.
For sure.
Okay, let's move on then to the next one. The Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination was one of the most contentious in recent memory. Without getting into the substance of the arguments or anything, what was the political benefit, and did either side, what was the political impact, and did either side benefit from it?
I think they both did at different times.
Yeah, that was going to be both did. I mean, I can point to some specific races where it made more of a difference. I think the Missouri Senate race would be one because it sort of, breathed new energy into the Republicans' campaign. But it was the thing that woke up the Republican base in a way it had not been attentive before. And while everybody's first guess was that it was going to motivate Democrats, they were already there. I don't know how much more room they had to grow. Republicans had all kinds of room to grow. So it did in fact motivate Republicans and probably helped them in some Senate races. I'm not sure it helped them in the House. You would know that better than I.
Look, I think it was an actual pinpoint to point to when Republican base woke up, as Jennifer just said. I do think, no, I don't know to the degree it would have been, but I do think it was going to happen regardless. But it was a natural pinpoint on the date, on the calendar when it actually happened. Now, look, I'd say we swept California, got all 7 seats we contested there. Do I think it helped there for us? Absolutely, for sure. But do I think that in other places, like I think of a Minnesota 2, where Angie Craig, that was a race we felt comfortable with all the way throughout, but we did see some tightening. We certainly saw a lot of tightening across the board the immediate week after. We saw, we were feeling the last polling kind of reflected with our high water point at the end of September, and we did get really damn nervous, we got really nervous right after the Kavanaugh stuff, because we saw a lot of polls getting tighter and/or us losing the lead in a lot of polls right afterwards. But again, it got back to the original to the high mark of late September, which I think if you go back and look historically, and Jennifer and other folks on this panel would know more than I would, but I think that even in 2010, when we had a massive wipeout, we saw, and it wasn't any real reason, but there was a slight blip in us getting closer in early October, and same thing in 2006 and 2008 for us. We saw the polls getting tighter. It just happens when the other base wakes up, which is inevitable no matter what happens. At some point, they're going to take notice of the campaign. But do I think it had an effect? Yes, but do I think that people talking about it, and I can't speak to the Senate polling because I haven't seen it as much. This is just me as a outside observer to the Senate stuff, but I think I think some of the places like Indiana, Missouri, places like that, I think that was naturally going to get, some of that was going to naturally get there no matter what.
Yeah, I would tell you though that throughout this cycle, there were a lot of conservative operatives who were very worried about what they saw as a conservative enthusiasm gap. And there was certainly the hope that their base was going to wake up, but they didn't know what was going to do it. There was a lot of anxiety about the failure to repeal Obamacare after years and years of promising to do it. They got the House, Senate, and White House, and they couldn't fulfill that promise. There was a lot of concern that that had demoralized the base, and that doing things like the tax cuts or the tax bill, like that still hadn't gotten them to where they needed to be. And then you spoke to a lot of them in October, which very much the home stretch, and they felt that that gap had closed. And of course, we were talking about turnout certainly in Senate races, and of course in lots of other in House races as well, and of course massive Democratic turnout. But Republicans showed up too, and a lot of conservatives for a long time had thought that that was in doubt, and ultimately their voters did turn out in a lot of places. It was just the case that at least in the House, there were so many more on the other side.
But don't you think this is? I heard a lot about that from them too, from other operatives too. But don't you think? I always thought the one thing, Trump put it, for better or worse, he went all the way out there, much more higher than Obama did in 10 for a lot of folks, right? And I think that I'm sure Kavanaugh was definitely an ingredient of that, but I do believe that he brings out voters that aren't traditional. He brought a lot of people who aren't traditional voters, and yes, he used Kavanaugh as a tool for that. But I think he, in particular, was much more of a driver than any one set of issues, in my opinion.
Right, and look at where he went, though, right?
For sure.
He'd go to Missouri, and he didn't go to St. Louis, he didn't go to Kansas City, he went to Cape Girardeau. Mm-hmm. He went to Chattanooga, but not Nashville. He only went places with really high concentrations of Republican voters and places where he did very well in 16. So I agree that he really, he went to Montana 4 times. I've never seen a president do that in any.
Neither has Montana.
What's that?
Neither has Montana.
Yeah. Usually you're lucky if you get a visit. There's a number of states he went to 2 or 3 times for Senate candidates. But what was most interesting to me was where he went.
Oh, and I certainly agree. There was no more decisive factor when it came to turning out Republicans and energizing Republicans than President Trump. And you saw that all over the Senate map. Of course, not everywhere here in Kansas. Of course, he appeared with Kobach, and even though this is a red state, that was not enough for Kobach. But of course, there's other dynamics at play there. But when it comes to mobilizing the conservative base, absolutely Trump a crucial factor.
I think there was a combination of both. Between Trump and Pence, they made a number of stops and visits to Missouri, and I think it was Pence that came to Kansas City at one point. Like, Trump has done a masterful job of continuing to rally his base and to keep them energized and to keep them mobilized, and I think that showed up in the midterms, and I think the Kavanaugh situation only propelled some of that. It took so long for the decision to be made. It went all the way through October. There was no real October surprise, right? Kavanaugh in Missouri was that. So that, coupled with the visits from Trump and Vice President Pence, I think motivated and galvanized, and coupled with the propositions on the ballot that Republicans also voted for. It brought out Democratic voters, but it also brought out Republican voters, created a red wave that made it more difficult for McCaskill to win. And Kavanaugh was used in an interesting way with black voters. In Missouri and Indiana, there were ads ran on radio that essentially said, on black radio, targeted black voters, that said, if Kavanaugh could be falsely accused of sexual harassment and rape, what does that mean for black men? And this is why you can't vote for Democratic candidates. And those ads were probably a little more impactful and hurtful for Democratic candidates than we would like to believe. They were ran frequently. A lot of money was spent to run these ads. And as manipulative and racist as they were, on some level, I think they were effective. I talked to people on the ground, and they say, we can't trust, Claire McCaskill. I heard this radio ad. These ads, with this type of language and issues, they were ran all the way back in June, when Democrats were not running ads on black radio. So African-American voters had been listening to these, again, manipulative ads for quite a while before McCaskill and other Democratic candidates got on radio to talk to black voters. Now, black voters are savvy enough to know that that's not the case, but you can't ignore the fact that this historical issue of being falsely accused, black men being falsely accused of rape and sexual harassment doesn't strike a chord. It does. So when I think about Kavanaugh, that's what I think about, how that issue was essentially twisted to reach out to black voters to get them to sit out the race. When they did an interview with the black Republican operative who made the ads, and his goal was not to get black voters to vote Republican, it was get them to not vote for Claire McCaskill, right? I don't even want you to vote for a Republican candidate or a Democratic candidate. I just want you to sit out, right? And those ads were ran, very early on, and a lot of money was spent on that. So when I think about Kavanaugh and his impact in the midterms, that's what comes first to mind for me.
Any other thoughts? Okay.
I would just say Kavanaugh united Republicans. I think that Susan Collins' speech at the end, laying out the case for why she was going to vote for Kavanaugh, was a real gift to Republicans, particularly more establishment, moderate, not the Trump base, that had been feeling kind of disappointed with their party. Seeing the party so united on that, and it wasn't just a Trump issue, I believe also brought out establishment Republicans.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was talking with a Republican strategist who said, he said that the reason that was helpful for Republicans was because it changed the conversation from Trump. This was not about Trump. This was about an issue that, and certainly a very polarizing issue, and I know people have strong views on all sides, but for Republicans, certainly, as Eliza said, it was a bit more of a unifying issue, even for people who otherwise didn't like Trump. I think that was not sustainable ultimately with those people who didn't like Trump, and especially, so someone was mentioning earlier, kind of the events of the last 10 days of the campaign. There was so much uncertainty and chaos, and a number of violent acts, but playing out. So that certainly took the conversation away from that. But at least in that moment, I think that helps explain why we did see a bump for Republicans, really kind of across the board.
I'm afraid to answer that. I think my throat might fail me again, but I'm going to try. I agree that it was kind of a point in time that galvanized the base, but I think what's interesting to me is that in terms of how it politically impacted the people who had to make the vote, it was the most significant for the women who had to cast the vote. Those are the ones who had to explain why they were doing it one way or the other. That was kind of it was like their burden to bear about their decision. The other thing that struck me as interesting, and this is more personal than political, but it made me think differently about that particular, the lead up to the day that Dr. Ford testified. I was in D.C. the day that Dr. Ford testified, and I had to be a couple places, and I was kind of struck by the fact that it was like just nobody was working. Everybody was just standing like close to the TV, like little kids, like with their mouths open, like watching. It was like riveting for everyone. And I had to travel back to Nebraska that day, and I was in DCA for a while. I was also in the St. Louis airport. And the thing that struck me, I'm a bit of an introvert, so I almost never engage in small talk with people. I'm not like the warm, fuzzy person on the plane that's going to tell you their life story. And I had about 8 women who I didn't invite to conversation just kind of randomly turn to me and tell me these heartbreaking stories. Some of them were just kind of lamenting having been sexually harassed, whether it was like at a fast food restaurant. I had a couple women like tell me their rape stories that they had to then, go on and see their professor at school the next day, or those types of things. And what struck me about that, because that's odd for someone to just, it was like every woman you encountered that day as a woman, they were talking about that hearing, and then they were sharing their own story. And I don't actually believe that it was Dr. Ford's experience or those hearings that brought that forward. I think if you think about the past 2 years, and you kind of start with, I guess the one that was probably, to me, the most like shocking and kind of harrowing is if you think of Dr. Nasser with the gymnastics and that entire trial and so many people standing up, and it was just so heartbreaking. And then you go on to Hollywood and you kind of see, in some cases actors that were relatively beloved fall because they were creeps behind closed doors. And then you add to that this particular thing, and I think it's an experience that unites women. Every woman has either experienced some kind of discrimination, some kind of sexual harassment, some kind of sexual assault, or knows another woman who has. And so it's kind of a uniting experience. And I think that was the interesting thing around Kavanaugh. I don't know that it played out into politics, but I do think that it was something which is interesting to me, that is like a uniting experience and a uniting issue and just kind of collective for women, regardless of what race, what social status you are, what party you're in. And I think the Kavanaugh hearings were interesting from that perspective. And on the political side, again, I think it was the female senators who had to answer all the questions about why they voted the way they voted.
Okay. I want to shift to another issue now. Did the Republicans place enough emphasis on the economy, or did the president kind of lead them or drag them in a pivot too hard to immigration at the end of the election?
Well, Republicans certainly tried to place emphasis on the economy, but the tax bill was not, it was struggling with voters no matter how much they talked about it. They just had a real messaging issue with that. And then, of course, the president coming in and changing the conversation to be about immigration or sort of these more base rallying issues hurt in some of these very competitive districts. But I don't think Republicans didn't talk about the economy. I think it just wasn't sort of catching the way they had hoped.
Yeah, I think the best analogy I've heard about this, we had the same thing in 2010, was you have a bunch of equations that look good on a poll and you talk them, but at the end of the day, it's like bringing a boombox to a rock concert, right? Like you just kind of can't, no matter what you do with this president trying to stay on message and no matter, even whether it's good or not, it almost didn't matter for them. Their messaging wasn't working, and they didn't have, and look, I would argue that it was the wrong message, and I think we saw it play out. I think we saw it play out when it did happen in a very tight organization, like in Pennsylvania 18, when it wasn't, when Trump wasn't as much in the equation. But I do think trying to talk about this was akin to bringing a boombox to a rock concert.
Any other thoughts on the Republican message?
I think in past cycles, I have always been impressed by the consistency, kind of to echo what Jason said, of the Republican message. And that's from top to bottom throughout the Republican organization. This cycle, you have someone at the top who the message isn't the same tweet to tweet, right? I mean, if he is or is not a Republican. I guess he is because he's got an R behind his name this year. You can't, that is the image of your party. The voter, if you ask them what is the Republican message in 2018, could they answer in a clear, consistent way? I'm not certain they could.
It's Trump.
Yeah.
But he's not being a conductor, you know? He's kind of a soloist
Right.
in this orchestra, you know? But, and in the past, the reason they were so good at it was there was a set of messages, somebody was leading the orchestra, and now that person doesn't really exist. You know, you have the soloist who, you know, you might be playing one piece and he gets bored 3 minutes in and he's off doing something else.
Well, I also am not sure voters would have given an individual congressman credit for the economy, right? Like, the economy's doing good. Trump gives all kinds of proof points about why the economy's great. I think in some cases, voters will accept that if it continues to go that same way. I think that could be the defining issue in 2020. But I'm not sure that people are going to translate that credit to a senator or specifically do it to a congressman. So I'm not sure that especially without a contrast, right? Like, they weren't going to contrast a Democrat agenda because you haven't seen one for a while. I think that added with the conductor analogy probably is maybe a reason why that issue wasn't quite as effective.
Okay.
You live by the economy and you die by the economy too. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens next year if there is a recession and how Trump and Republicans respond to that. Because the issue, this is all about Trump. They have not identified any core issues that they own other than the bad stuff and then Trump. So it'll be fascinating to watch how 2020 plays.
You know, normally I'd agree that you live and die by the economy, but the economy was doing really well in 16, and Hillary Clinton lost, right? Democrats lost.
But people didn't think it was. There's bigger things at play in America today than just raw numbers, and where people are saying the economy's doing great and America's doing great, and there's a whole lot of people in America who aren't doing so great, and it's unreported or it's unscored. The way we traditionally do it, and people feel that there's something wrong, that they just can't quantify it. And so when the economy's doing really well and the stock market is soaring and Trump could trumpet all these great things that are happening, it doesn't support the narrative that other people feel as much, but it props it up. But when the economy tanks and people are already feeling this angst, what happens then? Does the floor just fall out of support?
Okay. I think, I'm guessing that most of the panelists, if anybody disagrees with what I'm about to say, because I'm going to lump you all together on this one, I would guess most of you would agree that this was a blue wave election or something akin to it. But that's not the way I want to ask the question. I want to ask you your opinions about the last 4 two-term presidents, President Clinton, 94, President Bush, 06, President Obama in 2 different midterms in 10 and 14 had devastating results. Is this really all that different from any of those? Was it more significant in any way? Can you read more into it? Or is this kind of a cyclical trend that we're developing in this country where you elect the president gets beaten down in one of the midterms or maybe 2 of the midterms?
I think
I'm going to be on the side of this is cyclical. I mean, one of the interesting things we found this cycle is that we looked at presidential approval ratings in midterms going back, and we came up with the not so surprising idea that if a president's approval rating is 50% or higher, the fewer seats his party loses. If it's 46 or lower, the average loss of House seats is 40. How many seats did you pick up?
We're still hoping for 41, but 40.
40. And then it's not unusual. I mean, okay, it's only happened 5 times. But the idea that the House and the Senate split, where the Senate doesn't lose seats, That's happened 5 times. Given the map, I'm not surprised it didn't happen. It happened this time. So I'm calling this cyclical. I heard people the day after the election, most of whom had stayed up all night and probably were not thinking clearly, call this a realignment. And I don't think one election is a realignment. If we see some of these patterns repeated in 2020, and better yet, in 2022, then I'm happy to call this a realignment.
I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to, those aren't mutually exclusive categories, right? This can be cyclical and it can be a big friggin' deal, right? I mean, we saw the biggest gains in the suburbs for Democrats. And, you know, the taking back of the suburbs by the Democrats that they've lost over the past 20 years. We took back 380-some state ledge seats, I think, at last count, after losing more than 1,000 over the past decade. That's a third in 1-2 year span, right? That's big. And we did this, my partisanship is going to show through here, because I know Democrats do this too, but we did this in many states where the rules are stacked against us, and the rules have been changed for years to make it harder to vote, to make it harder to even get on, to register to vote, to make the lines drawn. North Carolina, we held elections, and it was like, yeah, you've just got to use these maps because we can't get new ones in time, is essentially what the court said, right?
Or in Kansas, where you had the king of voter suppression, right? And we were still able to get a Democratic governor and Democratic.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sharice
I mean,
Davis,
it's always hard, right? Every cycle is always hard. I think there are some unique or more unique challenges this time around where we still prevailed, and I am interested to see, to kind of tie it back to Kavanaugh. Like, I don't know what the Republican Party is offering as an alternative to recapture some of these voters or to attract women, minorities, others, as to why they should vote for a GOP message. What are they doing? I mean, we talked about Kavanaugh, and I think it reinforced the image of that a lot of people have had when you've had a president who's been accused of many things, is on tape saying some horribly disrespectful things about women. How are you going to change that? And the question may be, do you need to change that? I mean, he won, right? Do they need? I hate to say that as a human being, but he won, right? So I think it can be both. I think it is hugely important. I think some of it is cyclical. I think that women in general and African American, Hispanic vote, other minorities, how those trends lay out over the next 2, 4, 6 years will show if this was a realignment or not.
Yeah, and to build off those 2 points, I do think that the big question here is whether you believe the Trump era and the politics of the Trump era are an aberration or the beginnings of a realignment. And I would certainly agree that we don't have enough data, we don't have enough evidence yet to say for sure, but what this election did show us is that some of the trends that we saw, really sort of take root in 2016 only deepen this cycle, whether it was suburban areas. So I'm from the 3rd District of Kansas. So that was a district that went for Hillary Clinton by 1 point in 2016. And then this cycle, Sharice Davids, I believe, won it by nearly 10 percentage points. And that is, as I'm sure many people in this room know, that is like the ultimate Romney country. And so, to have a Democrat win there by nearly 10 percentage points, I think that is really significant. So the question is, do voters like those that did flip in my home district and in so many others like it in suburban areas around the country, is that part of the new Democratic coalition? If so, what does that make the Democratic Party look like? And then, of course, we saw in rural areas, getting places where Democrats have had DNA there for a long time in certain areas, become increasingly more conservative. And so I agree, though, that we don't necessarily have enough evidence yet, but around issues like the urban-rural divide, around other sort of divisions as it relates to education levels, we did see some deepening of some trends that I think we saw take shape last cycle. So I'm fascinated to see what that means for what the makeups of both political parties look like in 2020 and going forward.
I'm going to agree with Jennifer. I think it's cyclical. In 2006, President Bush called it a thumping. In 2010, I think President Obama described it as a shellacking. So I don't know exactly what President Trump has said.
He called it a big
Victory.
victory.
I think he said a tremendous victory, actually.
We won hugely.
Yeah, there we go.
I believe he called it the greatest victory.
Indeed, indeed. So, clearly it was a blue wave, but I think if you, even just looking at 2010, and the Republicans regained 63 seats in the House in 2010. They regained 6 seats in the Senate. I think they said it was the greatest loss by the president in power since the Great Depression. And I don't necessarily think that was, it wasn't the end of the Democrat Party in the same way that this isn't the end of the Republican Party. It was a bad night for Republicans, which is what was expected, is what historically we've seen. But I do think, to Kelly's point, with regard to coalitions and outreach, the Republican Party, Donald Trump did win. And I'm of the mind that he probably wins re-election, which, I don't know, I'm not in the business of making predictions, but I think
You'll get your chance tomorrow.
I think as long as the economy holds, but ultimately, Donald Trump is not, the Republicans aren't Donald Trump. He's unique, and I think Republicans as a party, he's leading the party. He's brought in new coalitions, and I think in some ways those are good. He's brought back some blue collar manufacturing workers to the party, which is great. But I think both parties, but particularly the Republicans, have to be thinking about how we do outreach to coalitions all the time. And I don't think it necessarily, a lot of times we talk about it in terms of gender lines or race lines. I don't think it has to be, I think individuals are more than just their gender or their race. And I think as a party, we need to be thinking about building coalitions outside of just those issues. But I think there's some cases where you've seen Republicans effectively usually just decrease their negative margin with some coalitions that typically aren't with us. And I think if you look at Florida and you think about the work that Governor Scott did over the years with the Latino community there, you really saw that pay dividends this cycle. And I think it's a good model for how do we think differently about how we communicate with people who aren't part of our traditional coalition. It needs to happen with the Latino community, it needs to happen with the African American community, and it very much needs to happen with women.
Okay, I'm going to apologize to the audience because I plan to do some Q&A and we're running out of time. So we will try to allow extra time tomorrow for Q&A after that session concludes. But I do have one last issue I would like the panelists to address that a number of you have brought up, the amount of money that was spent in this election cycle. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I saw a factoid printed somewhere that more money had been spent on behalf of campaigns in this cycle than in 2016, and I find that unbelievable.
It's true. The House and Senate races, $5.2 billion. Outside spending was up 61% over 2014. There were 5 Senate races that cost more than $100 million. Florida being king at $182 million. When you just look at candidate spending, Texas won that with candidate spending of, I believe, was $94 million or $93 million. Okay, but what's $1 million between friends? So yes, it hit a record for a midterm election.
Any other thoughts on this?
I'm just glad we got more of it this cycle than in the past.
I mean, if I were you, I would be taking a serious victory lap on how much you outraised Republicans.
Yeah, it was, I mean, look, as far as, obviously the outside help was tremendous. And the reality is this cycle, we spent $90 million at DCCC, but the reality is in 2016, we spent the same amount. And there was a ton of outside money. We spent a lot more in coordinated funds and field than we ever have in the past. But it also has great benefits. We had a great, with End Citizens United, who is another one of our allied partners, House Majority PAC, which is another one of our allied partners. Their budgets went up exponentially this cycle. They never expected to be at a place where they were at. And, the enthusiasm, not only from the outside groups, but the candidates, as we talked about earlier today. I mean, look, we had, I think that I remember doing these numbers at the end of the third quarter, which means that is July, August, September. We had, I think there were 8 candidates who raised over $3 million, and there were 30 that raised over $2 million in a quarter. Now that used to be, and there were a couple more that raised over $4 million. We used to be at a place where, it wasn't that long ago, hell, it was probably 3 cycles ago, where $2 million was an average budget for a house raise. And these folks are doing it in 3 months. And it was, look, there was, now, all these incumbents are going to have to figure out a way, because we're going to be, House Democrats are going to be back to being the redheaded stepchild at the party next cycle. But they're going to have to figure out how to cap that, how to keep that enthusiasm going. But this cycle, the amount of money and the investments we made early on in some of the digital stuff, and we encouraged the campaigns to make in terms of digital acquisition and getting those low dollar donors was tantamount to success.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground this afternoon. We have a lot of ground to cover tomorrow morning. Tomorrow we will talk about the implications of these elections and also talk about 2020. So I hope you can join us again. But now please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion this afternoon. Thank you all and hope to see you in the morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. I'm Bill Lacy, the director. We're delighted you could join us this morning. It looks like we lost some folks. It's their loss, folks, because you're going to hear a heck of a discussion this morning. So we're glad you could join us on this kind of nasty, cold, slightly snowy day. Remind everybody, I forgot to do this yesterday, and I heard a cell phone call off, so turn off your cell phones, if you would, please. We'll take a break at probably around 10:45 or 11. I will get, I promise, to Q&A today, which I missed. I want to recognize the students and faculty from Pittsburgh State, Wichita State, Emporia State, and Rockhurst, along with, who are here along with KU. Mentioned yesterday that John Rogers of the NRCC had committed to come to this, but you may have seen the story in Politico on the hack of the NRCC leadership. And so John was not able to join us. And today we're going to focus on what the results of the midterms mean, the implications of that, and what that says about 2020. As I mentioned yesterday, if you were here, how many people were here yesterday? Okay. Thank you, Kelly. Always the wise guy, right? As I mentioned yesterday, we were delighted to get this extraordinary panel together. So, and we have bio packs on the table back there. If you want to know more about any of these speakers, I'm going to introduce them, but just very, very briefly. We have Katie Glueck from McClatchy, Randy Brown from Edison, Michelle Whatley, who is a Democratic strategist and consultant, Jessica Flanagain, who is with Axiom Strategies, Kelly Dietrich with the National Democratic Training Committee, also our Fall 2018 Fellow. Jennifer Duffy, who is battling laryngitis, so I hope she can say a few things today. Cook Political Report. Jason Bresler, Political Director of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Eliza Collins, USA Today. And Jim Jonas, Centennial Strategies and Spring 2018 Fellow. So welcome our guests this morning, please. Every one of these, we've been doing these post-election conferences since 2006, and every one of them has featured a representative from the exit polling firm Edison Research. And today we have Randy with us. And Randy, could you take a few moments, probably 5 to 8 minutes, and outline what your exit poll highlights as the key factors in the outcome of the election?
Sure. Thanks, Bill. I'm going to start first with some demographic characteristics and how they voted, and then I'll get to some of the issues that we asked about. So one of the key determinations of the election was women. Women voted for the Democratic candidates in the House. 59% of women voted for Democrats. And it wasn't especially women of color. White women split evenly, 49-49. African-American women, though, went 92% for the Democratic candidate, and Hispanic women went 73% for the Democratic candidate. One of the other factors that I was surprised to see was that every age group under 50 voted for the Democratic candidate for House, or voted in the majority for them. In past exit polls, we saw the split at 40. So people 40 to 49 used to vote, or in 2014 and 2016 voted more for the Republicans. This year they voted more for the Democrats. A couple other points were college graduates. 59% of people who graduated college voted for the Democrat. And then we asked independents. So independents, 54% voted for a Democrat. In 2014, it was 42%, and in 2016, it was 42%. So that was a big switch from past elections. Then we asked, was this the first time you ever voted in a midterm election? So not the first time you ever voted, but the first time in a midterm. 16% of people said it was the first time they ever voted in a midterm election, and 62% of those people went for the Democratic candidate. Then we asked, who'd you vote for in the 2016 election? 8% of people said they did not vote in the 2016 election. 70% of those people went for the Democratic candidate. So the Democrats were able to get the people who didn't vote in 2016 to come out and vote for their candidates. So those are some of the key demographic that I want to talk about. Some of the issues, and for anyone who was here yesterday, you heard me say if I knew what the Trump approval rating was, I could tell you what the Republican candidates got. The Trump approval on our exit poll was 45%. The House Republican vote, as of today, it might go down a little bit as more California votes come in. I think it's at 44.9%. So you can see it tracked evenly. So then the number one issue was healthcare. As you remember, the Democratic candidates, kept focusing their campaign on healthcare. 41% of people said healthcare was the number one issue in America. 75% of those people voted for the Democrats. Then we asked, does the healthcare system in the US need major changes, minor changes, or no changes at all? 69% said major changes. 55% of those went for the Democratic candidate. We also asked what party would better protect healthcare for people with pre-existing conditions. 57% of people said the Democratic Party. So then we asked what the condition of the economy was. And 68% of people said it was excellent or good. So, but even though almost 70% said excellent or good, we then asked, well, what about your financial situation? Is it better or worse than 2 years ago? And only 36% of people said better. So even though they felt the condition of the nation's economy was good, they weren't feeling it in their own situation. And we asked some of the important issues that the Trump administration passed. We asked about the tax cut bill. And on the tax cut bill, only 29% of people said the tax cut bill helped them personally. And then we asked about trade. Does the trade policies of this administration help them? And again, only 25% of people said it helped them personally. So, even though this administration had some accomplishment, people weren't feeling it in their own situation. And I think that really helped get them to vote for the Democrats. The last thing I want to point out is we did ask what the recent violence, if you remember, there was a lot of violent situations right before the election. We asked them, well, how important to your vote was that? And 74% of people said it was important, and 54% of those people voted for the Democratic candidate. And yeah, I think those are the key points on why the election turned out the way it did.
Randy, if I may do a follow-up, then panelists, I'm going to let you guys offer any comments or reactions to any of the data that you just heard. Is it fair to say, based on what you just said, that the congressional vote essentially was driven by presidential job approval?
Yeah, we've seen that in just about every midterm that we've covered, that the president's job approval closely mirrors the vote that his party gets. So I think this was an election about Trump. Even though the Democrats focused on health care, the voters were focused on President Trump.
Okay. Any comments from other panelists on any of this data that you find particularly interesting? Okay. Well, we'll move into implications. Now, one of the implications for for planning for campaigns is early voting. That is a major change, I think, in the way campaigns have to be run. How does the option for early voting affect strategy and how campaigns are managed?
Happy to start. So look, it has definitely changed the strategy for us internally tremendously. I mean, we, number one, it allows you to start targeting voters who are, especially in midterms, who are infrequent midterm voters. Target them early on with, you're chasing them, you're sending them information. In some states, depending on the state, they automatically get a ballot. In some states, they certainly don't, but you send them a request form that they can follow up with. Then you literally start chasing those votes, meaning whether it's a call, a knock on their door, digital, any way, shape, or form, and you're chasing, and you're literally just trying to expand your market. Now, in other states, like in Minnesota, where it's one of the highest vote, the turnout in Minnesota is always one of the higher turnout votes in general everywhere. And at some point, you have to decide strategically if you're just moving the election date up for voters, or you're actually adding new voters into the equation. So in Minnesota, it's you do a little bit, you only start targeting for early vote people, again, who are never vote or very rarely vote in midterms. But for us, empirically, it is what we try to do to bring more people into the fold who are Democrats who usually don't vote in midterm elections. It also, for what it's worth, makes you start, like in California, for example, they're going to start dropping ballots in California before right when Iowa starts voting for the presidential race, right? So while these campaigns are caucusing, they're going to have to be simultaneously spending money and communicating in California because it just moves up the election date and the decision-making process that much earlier. So it makes those campaigns that much more expensive, but they have to start communicating that much earlier than strategically than in the past.
Okay, I wonder from the journalists, how did that affect the way that you guys covered the early voting? Did that affect the way you guys covered the election?
Well, in 2016, I was tasked with reporting pretty frequently on the early vote, and there were lots of people around who, did a lot of analyzing of the early vote, but that turned out in 2016 to not yield the results that I think a lot of people had expected. So this time around, I was a little bit more skeptical about what the early vote numbers were telling us, because it is the case that ultimately, until you get to election day, you just don't know how many of these people, wouldn't have otherwise just turned out on election day. Essentially, how many more voters are you sort of adding to the pool? But I think no doubt it was a good test of early energy, of in some cases early momentum, no doubt. And this time around, it actually did end up giving us more insight into what might happen on election day.
And I think the same thing at USA Today. We were pretty skeptical of the early vote because of what had happened in 2016. And we were also we had seen so much enthusiasm from Democrats starting at the Women's March that we just didn't know how big of a turnout that would be. And we were seeing early vote numbers that showed that these women were turning out, but we weren't sure if that was just they were turning out early because they were excited, or that meant an increase overall. So in hindsight, it's easy to look that those were good indicators, but we were skeptical. It didn't report much on early vote either.
Oh, yeah, it certainly made my job harder because you don't know who's banking early votes and who's not. And, the early numbers on early voting suggested a turnout of presidential proportion, which was never going to happen in a midterm, even though turnout here was historic. So, I think it's great. I think early voting is great because it brings more people into the process. But as an analyst, it certainly makes life a little tougher.
Randy, I'm curious, you may not have this data at your fingertips or off the top of your head, but did you guys find out what percentage of the voters, how do you reflect the early voting in the exit poll, and do you have an approximate percentage of people who voted early?
The percentage who voted early, I believe it was 35 to 40%, but wow. I'm not, I'll have to remind myself of that. So what the exit poll does, we started this in 2004, is because more people are voting early in states, we actually do phone polls 10 days out from the election to try to get the absentee voters, because if you just talk to people who vote on election day, you're not getting the full picture. So we do that in states with high absentee rates and the national survey. And in just about every survey this year, the the vote for the Democratic candidates was a little bit higher in the absentees than it was on election day.
The one other thing I would add is, as much as Eliza and I were just talking about trying to be, and Jennifer were talking about trying to be maybe a little bit more cautious when it came to analyzing the early vote, that didn't stop strategists and operatives on these campaigns from very much reading into what the numbers were suggesting. And, you know, I remember talking the Saturday before the election to a smart Republican strategist working on a very prominent campaign who was in a panic because this person was really struggling to sort of model who these voters were who were turning out in the early vote because, you know, of course, some of these people maybe had not voted in 2016 or, of course, hadn't voted in a midterm, and this person was just very nervous because, it was, in fact, very hard to gauge. So definitely a lot of operatives reading into it.
Okay, one of the things that I found fascinating about Randy's data was that 16% of the voters, did I get that number right, were first-time midterm voters. What do you guys think caused that? Is it President Trump? Is it as simple as that, or is it more complicated?
I think broadly President Trump. I mean, I'm sure there's more, but I don't think we'd see those numbers if it was President Hillary Clinton.
They may have been different voters than
That's true.
what turned out. I do think it was a lot of folks this time turned on by Trump, but I also think it was a lot of young people who turned out too. I don't know if you have numbers on what the ages were, but I think it's higher than younger in usual midterms.
Yeah, it was a little bit younger. It was 13% of voters were 18 to 29 and 7% were 18 to 24. That's a couple points higher than past midterms.
Okay. Then my final question on turnout would be, I think, is, you know, we would like to interpret these figures as people are going to be more actively engaged in their, you know, in democracy, but did it represent that, or does it really just represent a one-time reaction to the current political situation?
For me, it's a little bit of optimism, but I think so. I think in general, historically, midterm turnouts are usually lower anyway, and so to see an uptick in an election season that usually doesn't have the numbers that we've seen with women of color, with, you know, women, with young people, I think if we can turn them out in midterms, we continue to engage them, then we can certainly turn them out in the next presidential election. So a little of that is optimism, hoping that this is just the start of continued momentum as far as civic engagement and voting is concerned with Americans overall.
Okay. Can I ask you guys to speak to the success that women, minorities, and the LGBT community had in this election?
I guess I can speak to that. I think that the successes were overwhelming. We talk about whether there was a blue wave or not. I would argue that there was a woman's wave, a young people's wave, a wave of color. You saw candidates of color, you know, winning and making history in all kinds of races up and down the ballot, even in races where there were not wins, such as Stacey Abrams in Georgia and Gilliam in Florida. You saw candidates who, you know, at the start, who we never thought would make it out of their primaries, end up in races that were highly contested, nationally viewed, and watched, you know, races. So I think not only are minorities, women of color, and women showing up at the polls in strong numbers, I think they're winning races. They're winning races, they're taking seats, and as the Democratic Party and even the Republican Party looks to move forward, we need to be thinking about how we continue to gauge these constituencies, because they're showing up and showing out.
Yeah, look, and it was, we mentioned Gillum and Stacey, but the fact that these were high-profile candidates and getting national news was, I think, really exciting for folks all over the country. But also, look, Jennifer and I were talking on the way over here, the Asian vote went from, Democrats won the Asian vote in 2016, but this cycle won it by what to Republicans should find a very alarming level. It was a big reason why in Orange County we swept, which used to be the Republican oasis of California, that their entire, there's no Republicans left in Orange County anymore because, a lot of reasons, but a large part of it is because of the Asian vote. LGBT voters LGBT and women, we saw, it helps that we had, that there were these amazing candidates all over the country, but it also helped that Donald Trump was invoking them and bringing them out to vote every single day. But it was, look, I think, I hope Democrats don't take them for granted going forward. It is a mistake. It would be a mistake. We went in very, very early on and invested in all kinds of communities of color and bought radio station, bought time on radio stations, bought time on church newspapers and things like that had not traditionally been a thing done. We made a national Hispanic television broadcast buy, which again had not been done. And even in districts where there were 8% Hispanic vote, we went on, we bought all kinds of television time in Arizona 2, for example. It's an 8% Hispanic district, but we went on at the end. We had an older Caucasian woman running against a medium-age Hispanic woman, and we wanted to make sure that it was a must-win seat for us to win the majority. We went really hard on Spanish digital, Spanish radio, and Spanish television at the end. And I really hope that our party continues to invest in those mediums.
And not only invest in the tactics and resources in the sense of getting folks elected, but even on the other side and investing in talent and leaders to work on these campaigns and consultants to do the work. Jessica mentioned yesterday that the Republican Party could essentially take a second look at how it engages other constituencies, and part of that is bringing people of color, women, and for people from the LGBT community into the Republican fold as operatives, as consultants, because when these folks have a seat at the table and can make decisions on how to reach these constituencies, that's when you start to see change, and that's when you start to see issues come to the forefront that wouldn't in campaigns, and that's when you start to see greater engagement with these constituencies groups. So it's not just putting money in radio and just putting money in ads, it's making sure these folks have a voice and a seat at the decision-making table in campaigns and when these legislators get elected.
I don't think there's any question that the Republicans need to have a strategy and a plan to reach out and engage additional constituencies. I think for me what was interesting looking at this year was the number of women that were elected. I wish more of them had been elected from my party. I think we actually lost females representatives in the House, which is discouraging. And I was reflecting back from just taking I guess not long historical perspective, but a short historical perspective. I think it was 1992 that they dubbed the Year of the Woman because women had run for office, won office, and turned out at a historical rate. And now this year they're kind of saying the same thing. And I think that's true, and I think that's good. What concerns me about it as a woman, this is more a personal reflection than I think it is maybe a political reflection. But those are both years. 1992 was directly after the Clarence Thomas confirmation, the Anita Hill hearings. And this year, as we talked a little bit about yesterday, you had a lot of things leading up to it, the Me Too movement, and you had that happen this time. So for me, I don't really view it as the Year of the Woman. I'll think it's the Year of the Woman when we elect a woman as the commander-in-chief, or when we have a lot of female engagement when there hasn't had to be some kind of earthquake for our collective consciousness on sexual abuse or harassment.
I'd add two things to that in terms of how the Republican Party is dealing with trying to bring in different constituencies, including more women voters. Of course, as I'm sure a lot of folks remember, after the 2012 election, there was something called the autopsy report, authored by leaders, it's referred to as the autopsy report, authored by leaders of the Republican National Committee, and there's this big push to bring in more women to try and make the party more diverse, to reach out more aggressively to the Latino community and to younger voters. And there is a lot of frustration now that that report was effectively shredded in the 2016 campaign in terms of some of the language that we saw used throughout that campaign. And I've spoken with a lot of Republican operatives who feel that the lessons that the party was starting to embrace post-2012, went on to be ignored because, of course, the party won in 2016. But they now sort of feel that there was some missed opportunities there for some reflection, for some building on the recommendations that Reince Priebus, who of course went on to be the president's chief of staff, was actually advocating for just a couple of years ago, and that now, even though the party went on to lose this cycle, at least in the House, there's still not sort of that level of reflection and maybe going back to some of those principles that they were initially embracing or advocating for. But the second piece of this is I would flag Elise Stefanik, who is a Republican lawmaker from New York, and she's very interesting. She's really made it part of her mission to recruit more Republican women. She has said that she's going to be really involved in trying to get more Republican women through primaries next cycle. In fact, interestingly, she and the incoming NRCC chair have already been at odds a little bit over this, but she says that it's really important for the Republican Party to diversify, to be a bigger tent, to get back to what the autopsy report was talking about just a couple cycles ago. So she's very much someone to watch, and it'll be really interesting to see what successes she may be able to pull off.
And to Katie's point, I'm so glad you brought up Elise Stefanik. I do think we may see some of the women, the Republican women, start to be more vocal. They lost Mia Love, who was the only African-American Republican woman in Congress. They lost, the number of Republican women went down while the number of Democratic women went up, and the Republican Party became whiter and more male. And so I think the remaining women are very frustrated, and we may see some more vocal conversations about that. But I have talked to Republican sense who do not seem to be taking the Republican men sense who do not seem to be taking the same messages. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that shakes out.
And you see it happening in their caucus right now. I mean, I'm sure this is all little insight. Susan Brooks and what's her name is there? Ann Wagner. Ann Wagner was going to the NRCC chair and was passed over by Tom Emmer, and Ann Wagner has been an incredible fundraiser. She works in a district that is becoming more, it's in St. Louis suburbs. It's a suburban, educated district. Like, it's somebody they should be promoting up. And Susan Brooks in Indiana was passed over by a younger, more junior male for the steering committee. So I hope you will start to see folks like Elisa Stefanik on their side and other folks make noise about it, because it is, I do think that is, even as an outsider, somebody watching is a sad thing to see for their party. But I don't think the Republican men, at least in the House of Representatives, took any cues from anything that happened this last cycle.
Well, let me follow on this discussion with a question. About 15 years ago, Teixeira and Judas wrote a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority. And they basically argued, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, guys, but they basically argued that the changing demographics of the country were going to favor the Democrats and favor a progressive majority in the future. Well, we found out in the short term, those demographics were changing, but it didn't really change outcomes that much. Judas kind of abandoned the theory. I don't think Teixeira has, but is that what we're seeing here? And if it is, isn't this a real severe problem for the Republican Party?
I'll just go real quick. There was a lot of talk last cycle from a lot of smart people in academia that suggested that Republicans can no longer win the presidential race. And look, I think that is. I think people who get too far out over their skis suggesting anything like that are just silly. Look, we parties are going to change. They always do. And look, eventually they're going to have to wake up and have a come to Jesus moment about their party and what's happening in the country. But to suggest that to think that the world's changing, that the country is changing that much, that there's not space for two parties, I think it's premature.
Well, and I think the notion of there being a shift because of change in the demographics, and that essentially demographic diversity would lend itself to democratic values on some level may be true, but I think on some level, when I think about African American voters hold very conservative values when it comes to abortion and women's reproductive rights, when it comes to LGBT rights. We have very conservative values, but because the Republican Party, in the minds of a number of African American voters, has positioned itself as at times being racist and discriminatory, it makes it hard for African American voters to subscribe to the party. There are African American voters that subscribe to the economic principles of, the Republican Party, but because it seems to lead with this racist bend, it's hard for African Americans to subscribe to it. And so when you look at what happened with Mia Love and her not winning her seat, and then the Republican president essentially ousting her in one of his speeches, as African-American voters, you kind of wonder, my principles align, but how do I, go to a party that would treat the only African-American female Republican in that way when she loses? So I think the Republicans miss an opportunity to expand their base because of how they've positioned themselves and how their values regarding people of color come off.
So I would say two things on this. The first is certainly that is something that, what you laid out is something that a lot of Republicans have been worried about for a long time. And interestingly, at least in the past, some of the Republicans who have been most proactive about trying to sort of broaden that tent have come from Texas, whether that was President George W. Bush, who had really historic numbers with Latino voters for a Republican, or actually Rick Perry, who made a big effort to reach out to the community as governor in Texas. And actually, the former Texas Republican Party chairman, Steve Munisteri, who works in the White House now, or at least did last time I checked, he as Texas chairman, made that a huge piece of his platform. So no doubt that, there are some Republicans who have been sort of sounding the alarm bells for years, but at the same time, we've been hearing about this for years, and that alone, and, thinking that one day demographics are going to change enough that suddenly, Democrats have, an automatic victory on the presidential map, that's not a strategy. You see Florida, for example, as a very diverse state, and of course, went for Trump in 2016 and went Republican both at the Senate and a gubernatorial level this cycle as well. And so, I think that there's a lot of talk and a lot of discussion and thinking really on both sides about how to take, thoughts about ensuring that everyone has diverse coalitions and how to turn that into victories on a presidential map. But I think as much as we've talked about the challenges for Republicans in the House this cycle, taking a look at the Senate map is a reminder that, winning a national election for Democrats, just taking a look at that map, considering places like Florida, like Ohio, that is still a challenge. And so, especially after the results from last time. So it'll be very interesting to see, I think, maybe which states end up being more contested next time. Is it that, Arizona is more of a battleground than Ohio next time? It's possible. So I think it's going to be a very interesting map.
And I will point out that President Trump did expand the Republican base.
Absolutely.
It just was not the way they had called for in 2012. But he did bring in new voters, and he did expand the party and
the map.
And the map.
Pennsylvania,
right.
Michigan.
They easily won in states that previous Republicans did not.
And I think any attempt to look at this election and think that it's, indicative of what's going to happen in future elections, you have to look at it from a historical perspective. It's a cycle. And so I think there's probably broad agreement that the Republicans need to do some outreach and consider how they connect with different communities a little bit more. And ultimately, I don't think that work gets done at the national level. I think that's a state-by-state thing. The House, the members of the House, their leadership, they're going to do what they're going to do, but where that really is going to take place, where it's really going to take hold, where it's really going to make a difference is every state. Every state's going to have a little bit of a different makeup in terms of its citizens. I think I mentioned yesterday what happened in Florida and what I credit to Governor Scott in terms of his outreach over the years and how the Latino vote went in that state, I think is really a good model. I think a lot of people dismiss that because they say, oh, Cuban Americans are going to be different than Mexican Americans or that type of thing, but that's true in every state. You're going to have a different makeup of citizens, and I think every state party, every state chairman, all the Republican elected officials, you need to conduct outreach, and I think Republican governors are the best people to do that. Because they are in the news every day. They are going to the local county Republican Party meetings. They're at every state central committee meeting. And I think the Republican state central at the state party level, with the Republican state central committee meetings, they should go out and recruit people who are, sometimes people share your values, like you've said, and I think that's really true. And you'll see it in other ballot initiatives or other kind of social organizing efforts. People just have to be asked. It's if you're not somebody who's either a student or just kind of somebody who doesn't mind showing up when you haven't been invited, then the State Central Committee seems like a place for you. But for a lot of people who don't feel comfortable just showing up in a room full of people they don't know, they have to be asked to participate. And what I've found when it comes to candidate recruitment is that usually people who are minorities, whether they're women or whether they're African Americans or, we've got a lot of Native Americans in Nebraska. They have to be asked to join. And the Republican Party just needs to do a better job of inviting people to join us, because they may agree with us, but they're not at the table, in large part because we just haven't thought to ask them. And I'm saying that at a local level, because I really think that any kind of long-term change, that's meaningful change and meaningful outreach, it's going to happen at that local level, and it's going to be sustained over time.
I gotta jump in on that, and I'm worried that, I don't want you to be the lone Republican voice up here. We have a tilt to the left, definitely, but actions matter. And if it's local, if it's national, if you are redrawing boundaries and lines and eliminating Native American voting spots because you don't want people on a reservation to vote, if you have a leader in the White House who calls people rapists and criminals because they're seeking a better life and they're not the same color as him, that's not who America is, and your party is made up of the people in it. And actions matter. And the Republican Party, forgive me, I know I'm going personal here, but the future of our country it's up for grabs, right? Who are we going to be as a people? And parties change over time. Right now, I don't see a lot from the Republican Party that doesn't open their arms and embrace and empower and uplift anyone who is not privileged and wealthy enough to be in it already. And I know that's my personal point of view, but it is incredibly frustrating to see a party in power, and Democrats have plenty of our own failings, to see a party in power that is continuing to expand that power based on manipulating the rules and the system. If you win a minimum wage increase in Wisconsin or Michigan, and now the legislature is gutting the bill before the Democrats can take over, right? Government is of the people, by the people. We're not supposed to change the rules of the game as we go along, right? We're all Americans. We can disagree on these things, but yeah, sorry, I'm getting a little off topic there, but actions matter, and I don't see the Republican Party doing anything to expand their outreach to minorities, to other people of color who are not already in it.
I'll start by saying one of the things I like the most about politics is that it is probably the closest thing to a meritocracy that exists. You don't get to stay working in politics if you aren't actually good at what you do or are hardworking. I am the daughter of a single mom. I am the only one of my siblings to graduate from high school. Growing up, we occasionally used public assistance because it was necessary, and I understand the value of it. And I feel like, because you said something like it's not welcoming to people who aren't wealthy, I just don't think that's true. And one of the reasons I was attracted to the Republican Party is because I actually believe in the American dream, and I believe that some of the principles of the Republican Party allow that American dream to be perpetuated for generations if people choose to work hard, and that it actually is we have the best ideas in terms of individual liberty and dignity. That being said, I don't think Donald Trump is a cult of personality. And he's done some really great things as president, in my opinion. I like the tax cuts. I think the growth of the economy is significant. But I think you can't say to him, he's not somebody who came up through the party, right? Like, he's not George H.W. Bush. He didn't lead the Republican Party. He didn't kind of come through the ranks. And so I think one of the challenges that the Republican Party has been balancing that, having somebody who was kind of a surprise nominee and who brought a lot of other people into our party. But I don't think you can assume that all Republicans are going to have maybe the same rhetoric. And the other thing I don't like about politics right now, and I've thought about it a lot because we're so polarized, right? It's like Donald Trump says something, he tells us that the sky is purple, and 45% of the people in the country are going to be, that's absolutely right, he's brilliant, right? If he comes out and says the sky is blue, there's 45% of Americans who are going to be like, that's not true, it's never been blue, it never will be blue, he's a liar. So, I mean, we are so polarized, it doesn't even matter what facts are, it's just about him. and there's some people in the middle who can be persuaded. And that's kind of how we're looking at it from elections. But the reality is, we inhabit a space with people who agree with us on a lot of things, and we're deeply divided on a few things. But we're still Americans. We're all participating in this democracy. And we've gotten to a point where we assume the absolute worst in people. And I think you know a lot of Republicans that you probably respect and like and don't believe are racist or classist or sexist. And I think as we think about how we go about politics, it's, for operatives, yes, it's about winning and losing. When it comes to redistricting, both parties are guilty of trying to draw favorable bounds. And I don't think any of us can be particularly self-righteous when it comes to power grabs, because it happens on both sides. But when we're talking about what is and isn't good for democracy, we should give each other more of the benefit of the doubt when it comes to dealing interpersonally as Americans, and understanding that even though we might deeply disagree with your ideas about how to get somewhere, there are a lot of things we really agree with when it comes to, we all want a robust economy. We all want a low unemployment rate. We all want national safety. We all want roads. We all want local public safety. So there's a lot more that we agree on, and I think if we just take a step back and assume the best in people first, that we ultimately end up getting better outcomes.
Well spoken by both of you. Let me ask a question. One of the, I think, most significant stories of the 8 Obama years that has been reported but not heavily focused on was the loss of approximately 1,000 legislative seats in that time period. One of the big successes the Democratic Party had is picking up, I think, about 300 legislative seats in this election. How significant is that, both in terms of what it portends for the future, but also in terms of what we could call bench strength, in terms of funneling candidates up to higher office?
Look, the last 8 years were a tough 8 years. After the first Obama session, the first Obama win, the next 6 years after that were pretty tough for us. But we saw it a lot at the state legislative level. Look, on top of building the bench, you've had legislators that are conservative legislatures, and to Jessica's point earlier, when you're in power, you want to execute your ideology, and they did. I think first and foremost, yes, it does help create a bench, and which is fantastic. We've had, the good thing about this cycle, I think the necessary thing about this cycle was a lot of our candidates had never run for office before, and I think that was probably, hopefully, just unique. I hope it's just unique to this cycle, because I do think there is a point when experience in policy matters, and getting more folks who are firm and understand how to craft and create policy is an important thing. But on top of that, look, I think getting back for Democrats to be in a place where, in places where where the Republicans don't have super majorities, and the huge government, the big huge gamble of government in a lot of states is a really good thing for us. And we won a lot of majorities in a lot of states that are tough places to do. Alaska, I think, have they done the coin toss yet? There's supposed to be a coin toss coming up soon to determine the majority of the Alaska legislature, which is really, we lost the last one in Virginia, but hopefully we win this one, which is just astounding. But look, it's a place where policy at the state level is frankly probably more impactful on everybody's lives than it is at the federal level. Those are the people that are going to affect your day-to-day life, and a lot of the stuff that comes, I won't ever tell this to people when they run for Congress, when we're recruiting them to run for Congress, but the reality is you're not going to affect your day-to-day life as much as the people in your state legislatures. And I really hope that Democrats, we really start paying attention to, and Jessica Post, who ran the DLCC, is a really good friend of mine, did a hell of a job. But the reality was we are a $300 million organization, and they were a $30 million organization. And they have thousands and thousands and thousands of races, and we have, we spent in 90 of them, right? So I do hope Democrats as a whole start paying attention to the legislatures, not only to win them, but to recruit stronger candidates and start funding them a hell of a lot better than we have in the past.
I'm going to rain on your parade a little. In terms of pickups, Democrats actually underperformed a typical midterm election by about 100 seats. And yes, you flipped some chambers, but a lot of them were coalition majorities. New York, for example. Republicans didn't sustain the losses we expected them to, which is interesting. I don't want to take away from, yes, you lost a lot of seats over 8 years, and 300 is great, 400 would have been better, but it's a start. But I agree that it's a great place to develop a bench, to not only run for the House, but for the Senate and even governor.
Okay, I want to move along to what I consider one of the most fascinating stories of the last 30 days. And that is a lot of Democrats being elected to Congress and saying, I am not voting for Congresswoman Pelosi for Speaker. Now, Burdett Loomis, Bird's here. Burdett Loomis, who was on the faculty here at KU, arranged and moderated a fascinating program we had here, I think in April, with John Lawrence. And John was Nancy Pelosi's former chief of staff. And I said to him, I said, John, is Speaker Pelosi going to, run again for Speaker? Is she going to be the Speaker? And he said to me, he said, well, she is just a cold, hard calculator. She will look at the numbers. She will know exactly where she is, and she will make her decision on that basis. So you see, right after the election, all these Democrats are saying, I am not voting for Pelosi for Speaker. I made that commitment to my constituency. I won. Some of them, I think 16, signed a letter saying that I will vote for the Republican candidate for Speaker, which is, to me, completely unbelievable. But how has she done this? She is going to be the Speaker, right? Does anybody think there's any possibility she's not going to be the Speaker of the House? How has she done this?
Look, she is John is right. She is one of the most talented politicians I've ever seen in my entire life, and having a front row view this cycle to her was awe-inspiring. And she, at the end of the day, people did what they did in elections, but her word was, she went on NBC, Meet the Press, and said, she quoted the wrong team. I think she said the Warriors instead of the Raiders, but she said the motto is just win. And just win, baby. And it was Al Davis who said it, but that was always her motto from the beginning. She wanted to win the caucus. She wanted to win the Congress back. And look, I think, and I'm sure other folks would disagree, but there's a reason why Republicans didn't want her to be Speaker again. She is very effective. Obamacare could have just as been easily be called Pelosi care. She was the one who got it through. She got it to the Senate with a public option before it derailed, and she is a very talented, not only people say that she works harder than everybody else, but she also works smarter than everybody else too. She is incredibly talented, and when she, to John's point, if she didn't have the vote, she definitely would have known it very quickly and wouldn't have run, but she knew she had it, went for it, and got it. And look, not only is there Republicans not going to be successful in keeping her from getting the gavel back, but the reality is there was no Democrat really that ran against her. At the end of the day, folks who were the anti-Pelosi folks had 2 years and didn't find anybody to run against her.
I mean, she's playing very good politics. She's horse trading with some of the people who were not on board. The good part of that is through something called the Problem Solvers Caucus, they got some really important rules changes through. Why are you laughing? I think some of them, consensus calendar and things like that, will actually move the ball forward. But what are you laughing at?
Look, I think the one thing she got done, I think is going to happen, I think is very important, is, and the Republicans do this, and I think it's a very good thing for the cap on chairs and our ranking members of committees. It's a good thing, I think that when we were down to historic low margins this cycle and for Democrats as a whole, and we saw good people, a lot of good folks when they saw there was nothing to rise for. I think Beto at the end of the day was a fantastic Senate candidate, but he also looked around and probably saw, where am I going to go in this caucus? And I think the same thing happens with Kristen Sinema and other folks like that who they move on because there hasn't been any path forward because the ranking members or the former ranking members, now committee chairs, it's a rather old meeting when they get together, and I think getting rid of getting caps on some of them, how long you could be committee chair, I think is a very good thing that I think is going to come out of this come out of her getting the gavel back.
Well, and talking about a bench, one of the reasons Pelosi has been so successful and there was nobody else to run against her is because some of this younger talent hasn't really had an opportunity to rise up in the party. She's done a very good job keeping her close people at the top that aren't going to challenge her, and keeping the other people, they can't become committee chairs. There's not a big place for them to rise. And I wanted to make a point about Republicans not wanting Pelosi to be Speaker. Republicans have an interesting relationship with Pelosi, and I'm curious what you think, Jessica, but she's very helpful for them on the trail for rallying their base. The base really dislikes her, and they love to run against her on the trail. But they all, at least almost every Republican I've spoken to, has great respect and sort of fear of her and what she can do over her caucus. And so it's this interesting, they love running against her, but she's actually not that helpful for them when she's in power in the House. And that's an interesting sort of dynamic.
She is a Democratic villain. Like, I feel like every Republican ad tried to find a way to put Nancy Pelosi in it, especially in the race against, with Claire and Holly. Like, you saw Pelosi so much, and it's just like, wait, who's actually running? Is it Pelosi or is it Claire Casco, right? So she's definitely a villain, so I'd like to hear your thoughts around that.
Well, I got to imagine there's a little bit of a sense of vindication at the NRCC these days, at least on this issue, because, of course, as Bill noted, there were so many of these Democratic candidates who, vowed to oppose her and indicated that, or they said, we need new leadership, and the NRCC throughout the whole cycle was pushing this argument that, they're not really going to vote for a Republican on the floor. How could they do that? This is kind of an empty promise. That's what they kept saying all cycle, and really trying to tie these candidates to Pelosi. Obviously, that ultimately was not part of a strategy that was successful for the NRCC at the time. But now it very much is the case that you do see, not everyone, but a number of these candidates who talked a lot about new leadership suddenly getting a little bit squishy, suddenly not giving really straight answers about what they would do, on the floor as part of a full committee. And I actually think some of that has caught other Pelosi detractors by surprise a little bit. I think that there had been a sense from some of her detractors in the Democratic caucus that, there was some momentum, in fact, some support for this idea of new leadership, and there was maybe a sense that someone viable was going to step forward. But, we were talking about this last night. It is hard to beat someone with no one, and it's been challenging for them to, find someone viable to actually stick with a challenge to her.
Okay. Let's talk a few minutes about one of the challenges that the Democratic Party faces, and that is kind of the division between, let's call it the establishment and the progressives. How do you see that playing out?
I think it continues to be a rift. I think that progressives, even if we look at local races, and again, I go back to Holly and Claire at one point in a radio ad, Claire, or the radio ad, pointed to the fact that she's not one of those crazy Democrats. I think there's a continuing kind of alienation of progressives that will make it difficult to kind of mend, progressives as a voting bloc and bring them into the Democratic fold. I know the DNC at one point was looking to hire a progressive allies leadership position, never hired that position. There seems to be a lack both at the local level and at the national level from the party, a lack of real outreach to bring them in the tent. And I think that on some level, progressives are so headstrong in their values that it makes it difficult to bring them in. On some level, there has to be some compromise so that we can, as one party, move forward. And sometimes progressives are not always willing to do that. So I think between both the party and progressive voters, there could be a little more either give or reach in or take, so that there could be a mending of fences. But I don't see how that comes about in time for 2020.
Look, I think this cycle was we had Democrats as a whole. I think we are actually, we will have pretty heated primaries, and we have in the past, and at all levels up and down, from Senate to House to state ledge to president. But I do think we are very good as a party of getting back on board together, everybody. And I think, look, progressives in general, look, we all would, at least us, I mean, we've met with a lot of the progressive groups this cycle all the time. And look, we always wanted to make sure, I think one thing that differs a little bit between the two parties of ours is, and we were talking about this last night, Jessica, a bit, like we are pretty, Democrats, by and large, we've never nominated somebody like Todd Akin. We've never, we haven't nominated somebody who, takes a race off the ballot that should have been competitive, right? And even when progressive candidates win primaries, like Stacey Abrams, like Andrew Gillum, we immediately the next day are doing we're all together, we're all friends, we're all moving forward, we're all working in the same coalition. So look, do I think that there's always going to be strife? Do I think we're going to see it play out over the next 2 years and some of the candidates who run? Of course. But I kind of don't think that, I think winning helps a lot of that stuff too. I think if we had not taken back the House this cycle, there'd be a lot of finger pointing all over the place. But I do think, and I think the same thing you saw in 2012 after Republicans didn't win the presidency, you saw an autopsy that wasn't, that may or may not have been looked at, and like people with a lot of finger pointing, just like the same thing on the Democrats after 2016. Winning helps, and I think those divisions are a little overstated.
I think there will be two interesting dynamics to watch. The first in Congress, if you all are on Instagram, you may have seen them already, but there is this group of young, very progressive new members who are women, many of them women of color from a variety of different and interesting backgrounds, who have come in and really made a big splash so far. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, a number of them who are seen together often. They are advocating for a whole host of progressive priorities. They become kind of social media stars, at least on the left. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how they integrate in the broader Democratic caucus, because a number of them already showed up at a protest outside Pelosi's office, even though they're over an environmental-related issue, even though they're actually supportive of her. So I'm very interested to see how they fit in with the broader Democratic caucus, because there are people who are already getting a lot of attention, and certainly, at least with some younger voters, generating a lot of enthusiasm. So that's a dynamic to watch. And then the other thing I would say more broadly is that as we head into the 2020 contest already, I think you're going to see all kinds of really interesting conversations over what does electability mean, because in my conversations with Democratic activists and voters so far, the overarching goal is just to beat Trump. But how you get there, you see a lot of different perspectives, and this is something that happened on the Republican side in the last several presidential primaries. But do you want a candidate who's going to light up the base and activists are going to be really excited to work for and turn out for, but at the same time some people are maybe concerned about whether that kind of person can win in a general election? Or do you want someone who definitely is not going to lose, Pennsylvania, Ohio, is going to be strong in the Midwest, but maybe is not someone who energizes a younger, more progressive base in the same way. So I think that is really kind of the next big chapter we're walking into.
Well, when you look at those two type of candidates, also what you typically see is this young, new, fresh, can rally up the race candidate is typically the progressive candidate who's outside of the establishment. And when you look at this candidate who is tried and true and battle tested and can likely win, that's more likely than not the establishment candidate. So that then becomes kind of where the tension lies, right? Do we want the establishment more of the same, or do we want new, fresh blood? And what does it mean to have that, right? When they lead, when they get into the legislature, whether it be at the state or national level, what does that mean for Democratic politics? What does it mean for progressive politics? And vice versa. What happens when you have the establishment back in power again? So in my mind, I think that becomes the enduring battle, and that's why it's going to be interesting to see whether progressives and the Democratic Party can come together to win in 2020 and what that looks like. And I think that's going to be challenging. If Senator Sanders is looking to run again, and Elizabeth Warren looking to run again against the likes of, Kamala Harris or Cory Booker, Joe Biden, that's how that's playing out. And so I think the party on some level has some work to do to bring those progressive voters in the fold. And again, progressives, we've got to, I consider myself a black progressive. On some level, we've got to think about what does it really mean to win and what we have to do to get in power. And it may not be, this pure sense of what, progressivism and democratic values looks like. So we got to think about that too. I think it's going to be a challenge.
I'm sorry. I'd like to get into 2020 a little bit more in a few minutes, but I think those are excellent comments to set it up. But I do want one more issue that I'd like to talk about before we take our morning break, and that is there's a lot of discussion about the possibility of the president and Speaker Pelosi working some sort of agreement on infrastructure. Is that a pipe dream or is that realistic?
I have my doubts that Democrats would give Trump a win like that close to 2020. I mean, I do think that Pelosi and Trump actually probably get along in some ways better than Trump and Ryan did. I think
Somehow
Trump
I actually believe that, Eliza.
I think Trump has come to really respect McConnell. I think they have a strained relationship, but a respect. They've accomplished a lot of judges and things in the Senate, but I do think that Trump and Ryan have always had a strained relationship. But I think the Democrats just got back power, and there's going to be all sorts of oversight and investigations, and Trump is not going to take that easily, and I think that could deteriorate the relationship. And then I just think that why would Democrats help the president right before he's up for re-election?
I think you're underestimating that everybody wants infrastructure. So if the president puts the House in a place where they're offering an infrastructure deal and the Speaker and the House members say no, then you've given him a win and given yourself a loss by just not playing ball. I mean, I think it's good for everybody if they do infrastructure, and everybody, because everybody wants to, especially in the, for those incumbents that are in swing seats or in seats that could flip back, they all want to go back and say, we got something done, and this is something tangible, this is something real, something everybody wants, and it proves that they can reach across party lines. So maybe they don't want to give the president a win, but I think President Trump is uniquely situated to force an issue better than most.
Yeah, I'm going to just jump in that this is one of the reasons why there's this explosive growth of independent voters in the country, is exactly this, is that the calculation has begun for 2020 when everybody wants infrastructure. Everybody wants it. But at the expense of giving up power, it's not going to happen. So it would be interesting to see if Trump, who in a lot of ways is the first independent president, if he wants to make that deal, and he's going to be looking for ways to, he needs a win, Pelosi needs a win, but are they going to be able to come to some form of agreement without the independents getting even more angry about the system?
Okay, we're going to take a break now. We're going to reconvene at 10 till 11, and we'll be talking about 2020. Okay, we're going to start our final session of our National Post-Election Conference, and we're going to get into some really interesting stuff here. Let's talk about 2020. My first question is, will the president seek re-election, and if so, will he face a nomination fight?
Nominee. He may face a fight from someone like a Kasich or a Flake, but I don't think they have much of a chance. Like we were talking about yesterday, Trump has about a high 80s, 90% approval rating with Republicans. So I do think he'll be the nominee if he decides to run, which so far he has said he will.
I think there's a small chance he doesn't do it. He declares victory, he said he did all his priorities, but it won't be, before the third quarter of next year.
Okay, Ed Quick, who is a former fellow and a very strong Democrat, just asked me what I think is a fascinating question. So I'm going to ask you guys, what if Trump doesn't run? What does that do to the Democratic strength and that we just saw in this midterm? Don't everybody answer at once.
Guess it depends a lot on who the Republicans would then nominate. It would be difficult to see them moving too far away from where they are currently, but they can pivot, and certainly would cause Democrats to change based on who they put forward.
I think a candidate like Nikki Haley, who has proven herself to be both sort of the Trump base likes her because she has been loyal to the president, but she has been able to stay far enough away in New York as UN ambassador. She's a minority, she's a woman. I think someone like that might be difficult for Democrats to beat.
Yeah, I'm just like thinking through this scenario. Does Mike Pence then start as the assumed front runner for the Republican nomination? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm like brainstorming, asking out loud, not stating.
Right,
But
I mean, not having Trump just changes the entire race. It's a big thing to wrap your head around.
Okay, well, Jennifer said you feel, and don't let me put words in your mouth, but there's a small chance that he might not run. Does anybody disagree with that? Anybody convinced he's going to run?
I think there's a small chance he does anything. I mean, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but like, who knows what he's going to do? I think there's a very, this was the greatest presidency of all time. I have united the world in peace, and thank you, and we'll go off into the sunset.
And do another reality show.
Yeah,
Who wants
start
to be
his own
president?
network,
Right.
right? Yeah, I mean, that is perfectly viable. Does he want to go through? I don't know. He likes the fight. He likes the drama. He likes the attention. I think he might relish the re-election because it's more about him.
What do you guys think about apprentice president?
We already have that, don't we?
I mean, the thing is, you're right, he loves the campaign, he doesn't like the job.
Yes.
The one theory I'll put forward that Joe Lenski, the head of the exit polling at Edison Research, has is there are 5 weeks, which is very rare, between the Democratic convention and the Republican convention. He thinks that if the Democrats nominate someone and Trump thinks he could lose, that would be the time that he could drop out, which would completely throw 2020 into turmoil. Let me be very clear. This is a 1% chance, but as
this
Kelly
is how
said,
internet
anything is
rumors get
possible.
started, by the way. Internet conspiracy theories start because of conversations like this. QAnon will be all over this.
Okay.
Well, and at the same time, I think there is a question as to what he thinks of the Democratic field. I mean, I think that there's been some reporting out there that suggests that at least with regard to some of the potential candidates, he's not been so impressed. Elizabeth Warren took some backlash for releasing a DNA-related video. Some people that had to do with what she has talked about as Native American heritage. Some Democrats saw that as sort of needlessly playing on Trump's terms, even without him, really sort of paying attention to her and putting her there. And of course, some of her supporters, felt that that was going to come up regardless, so she wanted to get out in front of it. But no doubt there are some questions from some Democrats about who might be strongest against him, and if he's taking a look at the field and thinks that he can get them all to play on his terms and sort of play his, play his game, as one might phrase it, you could see how he would relish that.
Well, it's clear that on the Republican side, there's one person who's really going to determine what the outcome is going to be for the nominee. On the Democratic side, it could be called a cast of thousands field. Now, Jennifer Duffy told me yesterday, and I find this fascinating, she has a list of 34 Democratic candidates for president. And I said, Jennifer, did you hear that Deval Patrick announced yesterday, or it came out that Deval Patrick wasn't going to run? She said, well, it's now only 33. So now, She's basically lost her voice, as you know, but she gave the list to Kelly, right? You want to just quickly run through that list for us, Kelly?
I will do it quickly, but we might be here a while. 2 former presidential candidates, Joe Biden and John Kerry. 5 former governors, Steve Bullock of Montana, John Hickenlooper of Colorado, Jay Inslee of Washington, Terry McAuliffe of Virginia, and Martin O'Malley of Maryland. Deval Patrick is scratched out. 9 U.S. senators are contemplating it, including Cory Booker, Sherrod Brown, Kristen Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Jeff Merkley, Chris Murphy, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren. 6 members of the House, John Delaney of Maryland, Tulsi Gabbard, Hawaii, Joe Kennedy of Massachusetts, Seth Moulton, also of Massachusetts, that'd be an interesting primary, Beto O'Rourke of Texas, Tim Ryan of Ohio, and Eric Swalwell of California. 5 mayors or former mayors, Michael Bloomberg, Pete Buttigieg, I always pronounce it. It's Mayor Pete from South Bend, Indiana. Bill de Blasio, Eric Garcetti, and Mitch Landrieu. Did I say Garcetti right?
Yeah.
Okay. I always want to pronounce it like it's straight out of The Wire, and that's not right. Miscellaneous, Julian Castro, Eric Holder, Richard Ojeda, Howard Schultz of Starbucks, Tom Steyer, and Marianne Williamson, who is spiritual teacher to the stars.
Yes.
I would also like to add that
She is announced.
she's formally announced. That's amazing. The National Democratic Training Committee also has 4 or 5 individuals who have signed up for our training that say they are going to run for president as well, ranging from like a retired firefighter in Alabama to many others.
Interesting.
Wow.
So you'll be teaching ballot access.
Apparently, who knows?
Okay, I have been known at these to now ask, okay, who will the nominee be? But in a field of, thank you, Kelly. In a field of 33, that would be completely unreasonable. So what I am going to do is ask those of you who want to contribute here to jump in and say, who should we be looking at as a serious contender? Not necessarily that they will win, but who is actually going to be able to muster the resources and the political support to actually compete.
I vote for the spiritual advisor to the stars.
I want to know which stars before I.
Oh, I think Oprah, right?
Yeah. Wow.
Okay.
I think that the way I look at the list, which grows and expands, and if any of you want to run, you've got a good shot. What are the factors that make you viable? Because they're subtly different than cycles past, right? We not only have the 4 Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, but in such a, then we've moved California up, right? And so how does that affect the race? Because running in California is expensive, and it's towards the front of the primary calendar. So if you want to be a serious nominee, you need to have name recognition, you need to have a network in place very quickly, and you have to have money to be able to compete and communicate. And then the strategy, the nexus, whatever you want to call it, that goes into winning a presidential campaign is not like a traditional U.S. House or U.S. Senate race, right? You are likely not, especially with 33 people in the field, going to be, well, I'm going to win Iowa, and then I'm going to win New Hampshire, and then I'm going to win, and I'm going to win. No, you don't have that money yet. You're like, well, I need to come in the top 3 in one of the first 4 states, right? Okay, well, great. Now we narrow down the field maybe to 12 instead of 33, right? I mean, how do we even figure out how many people get on stage for debates with 33 people?
Hey, welcome to our world.
Right, yes.
I'd offer up ranked choice voting for
I'm not opposed. Yeah, so it's those criteria that I look at, and then just with so many people and so many variables, it is impossible to predict an exact outcome. So when someone says they want to run, it's what are in my mind, what are their potential capability to put together an organization very quickly?
Because you could have some of that criteria in place and still not break through. You could have money and still not break through. You could have name recognition and still not break through. And so it's really hard to tell what are the factors that you have to have or across the board, make sure that you break through, and then how does that like impact your race? So
Yeah.
I think it's too hard to tell. I can't even.
It's fascinating and too
Yeah.
hard to tell, right? Like,
Yeah.
we could spend hours going through this, but like, how if Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Warren, and Beto all run, how does that split up progressives? How do women vote? So many different permutations are possible. But I would love to know everyone else's thoughts, or if they have a favorite.
Look, sorry, go for it.
I'll just point out that this was the problem Republicans had in 2016 that gave them Donald Trump. There were 17 people. They had the kitty table debate and the main debate, and there were people like Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and Christie who had money, had resources, and they didn't make it. So I really don't know what will happen.
So is that a cautionary tale? If we don't get it together, we might end up with the spiritual advisor like coming out on top.
Trump's spiritual advisor 2020.
I think, infrastructural needs all aside, which is obviously critical. I think one thing that you'll see, for Democrats in general, the ones that are successful are the ones that are, that have big aspirational talk about for the country, right? There's you have a big goal and you set out and you talk about, Barack Obama was, it wasn't that complicated, right? It was hope and change, and the less successful ones aren't able to do that. And look, when I watch, and I'm not going to name names, but you watch, there's a crew of senators who, when one domino fell, Democratic senators, one domino fell on a policy piece, they all rushed in to do the exact same thing the next day. That to me doesn't scream presidential, right? If you're big and you're bold and you believe in what the country should be, I think that is going to naturally separate the chief from the wheat here, the wheat in this thing. And I think we're going to see that, and I think it's going to be. Look, I know that natural comparisons are what happened to Trump. I just don't think that. I think we have different primary voters than Republicans do, and for better or worse. And I don't think that you're going to see I think that whoever is able to capture. And look, let's be honest. At the end of the day. Whether it's good for democracy or not, the reality is to be the next president, you got to catch a hot streak for 3 weeks in Iowa, right? Like, that's just the reality. And, who's ever in a position to do that and is talking, and to Kelly's point earlier, it has changed. It's going to play out a lot more in earned media than ever before, and it's going to play out, and that's going to be a day-to-day battle and not necessarily who has the best commercials and things like that. But I think one of the things that we saw last cycle, Bernie was an interesting candidate, but when he did that, the aspirational tone that he took in that, I don't know if you guys remember seeing, but the America ad, it was 2 minutes. It really, I was not a Bernie voter or supporter, but that got to me, and I thought that was really good. And whoever is able to do that and capture that, I think we're going to see rise above the whole crew very, very quickly, and we're going to narrow down the field pretty quickly, I think.
Man, I hope you're right. I mean, if it gets to be the convention will be in July. We had a little discussion about this last night. The DNC will be in July, and if you have, say there's 12 or 15 people with pledged delegates, and you go to a second ballot, the DNC has eliminated superdelegates from the first ballot, and if you have a brokered convention, the superdelegates come in and start voting. I mean, it is scary and amazing to be a political junkie's, dream. It'll be amazing. Yeah.
The dream of the brokered convention, I love
Right,
it.
the dream of the.
There's been some comparisons made to 2016 and the size of the Republican field, but as someone, and I don't remember who, pointed out last night, hey, Trump won, so you never know how that's going to work out, even with a big Democratic field.
Well, the biggest winner is going to be the hoteliers in Iowa. Somebody should go in and buy every hotel room and resell it for the number of people that are going to be descending on that stage.
Making a note right now. Sioux City. Okay, cool.
Also, by TV station.
Yeah, right.
Well, let me be a little more specific then. Just looking at Kelly's kind of list of qualifying factors, is there anybody out of that 33 list other than Joe Biden who is going to qualify on all those? Which is not to say he's going to win the nomination, but is there anybody on that? Maybe Kerry, maybe Harris because she's from California. Is there anybody who kind of is going to meet those qualifications, or is that something that really, until it starts, we really just don't know?
I think you have a lot of people who are immediately viable when they get in this race, right? You got Elizabeth Warren, she's immediately viable. She has a national name recognition, she has the donor base. Same with Kamala Harris, same with, even Cory Booker, like they're immediately viable candidates. And now, do I are there candidates out there like a Mitch Landrieu who could become viable? Yeah, I think he could. He's a mayor of New Orleans, pretty successful mayor, tore down, some Confederate statues, it's pretty hard to do in the South. And he's got an interesting story. So look, I think there's some folks who are getting in this race. I think a lot of the ones that are talked about all the time, Biden obviously, that are immediately viable, but I do think you have to pay attention to some of the other folks who get in, and Beto, of course, is immediately viable right now, if he gets in. But there are a lot of people who, I think there are about 7 to 8 right now that are immediately viable once if it starts. But it's going to be interesting to see who of sort of that second tier is able to move into viability, and it's going to happen. I think you're going to see how. Again, it's not going to be about the natural ways we do campaigns and win campaigns in House and Senate races. It's going to be about how their arc goes over the next, 6 months and how it develops and the vision they see for the country.
Yeah, I was going to say that what's going to be interesting to watch is because there's so many people playing and there's going to be so much money sloshing around, that it's going to be difficult for that second tier to break through, but they usually do. Somebody usually breaks through. But it's going to be more difficult if Steyer, Bloomberg, Schultz are all spending $1 billion in first early primaries. How there's going to be any oxygen left for somebody to break through.
I mean, even John Delaney is committed to spending $30 million in Iowa, right?
Right.
So
He's been running for like a year.
Right.
He's already aired ads.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, well, you're going to have somebody assigned one person for every caucus goer to personally escort them to the caucus. The only way to break through. Somebody's going to have an incredible message that really cuts through, and Beto could, maybe he can do that. Maybe there's a second tier that catches fire. Maybe there's somebody who's a completely alternative to what folks think, like my governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper, who's an odd, quirky guy, and he's going to be odd and quirky, and that may break through.
Well, and Gillum just met with former President Obama, right? So I think you'll continue to see other names brought up, and that only adds, to the list of like who's possible and who's not. But we also, as was mentioned earlier, you have to look at their arc as candidates. We also have to look at the landscape of voters and what they're looking for too. So when I look at Joe Biden as a potential front runner, I also see a 76-year-old white man in an era where people of color, women, and young people are emerging. No offense to anyone that identifies as old, white, and male, but maybe maybe that may not play as a great factor in this landscape. So I think, we also have to look at not only the arc of the candidates and what happens over the next few months, but what voters tend to trend towards and what they're looking for too.
I think that, I'm sorry. I think that no matter who gets through, though, Democrats will be united after the convention. I mean, every year there's the story, will Howard Dean's people support the people? Will Clinton's people support Obama? It's the same story every cycle, and every cycle everybody comes together, right? It's not like there's a third-party split lately within Democratic politics because the party is so united in making change and dumping Trump.
So I, after the election, did a story where I talked to a dozen top Democratic operatives and activists in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, to get a sense based on reporting as to which of these potential candidates had made the biggest impact during the midterms. Because, of course, many of them, even if they were not up for their own election, spent a lot of time in these early states campaigning with down ballot candidates, giving them money, offering volunteers to state parties. And the two names that I heard the most often, just in terms of who during the midterms had made the biggest splash, were Kamala Harris and Cory Booker. Both of them have been very active on the trail, Senator Harris is someone who drew, really historic crowds at places like Iowa, big events. She's someone that I know, like a number of these other potential candidates, has stayed in touch with a number of the candidates that she endorsed during the midterms. And Cory Booker is doing really smart retail politicking. I heard in Iowa that he went and he gave a speech and took lots of selfies with people, and then his team actually went on Facebook, found all these people who had posted the selfies, printed out these pictures, somehow got these people's addresses, and then Booker signed the photos and wrote personal thank you notes to like 150 Iowa activists. So, he's someone to watch, like doing really interesting sort of tactical stuff. And in a place like Iowa, caucuses, and of course Kansas has a caucus as well. It's based so much on personal relationships, and so he's someone who certainly served himself well in terms of deepening some of those relationships a little bit. And then of course lots of chatter about Beto O'Rourke, and of course Biden is also somebody who has relationships spanning decades and has stayed in touch with a lot of these folks. He's been in touch with a number of candidates. Elizabeth Warren has been in touch with a number of candidates that she's supported. She's helped on the financial front. She's offered endorsements and has, identified candidates running down ballot, got in touch with them very early, stayed in touch with them. Bernie, of course, I think there's going to be a lot more competition in the progressive lane this time around, but, he's someone who, has lots of name ID, and in doing this reporting, a number of people noted that of course he does still have a base, especially somewhere like New Hampshire, where he's got a bit, and other people could lay claim to this too, but can see a bit of a geographic advantage, which is something that would benefit Warren there as well. So, of course, all extremely early, but just based on who was showing up in these states early, who's already getting some of these conversations going, those are a number of the names that came up.
Okay, Jim Jonas, we always have a cast of independent party candidates for president. Is there any possibility there will be someone that, say, the junkies were all political junkies, but is there a possibility there's going to be somebody that we actually know who winds up running an independent candidacy, not a Libertarian Party candidacy, but an independent candidacy?
Well, John Kasich desperately wants to be drafted in to run as an independent. And I would not be the least bit surprised that he makes a run. Now, is there room for an independent to operate in that space? Probably not, but who knows, dependent upon who the Democrats nominate and knowing how Donald Trump will run. He'll get he probably enough to be included in the debates that could make it really, really interesting. So Kasich is certainly one. There are others who are being talked about. There's a movement to get ballot access for a candidate to be named later is in the works currently by a couple of different groups. So there may be, I know there's a couple of billionaires floating out there who are looking for a ballot access line to run themselves. So it'll be interesting to see it all shake out here in the next 6-8 months.
In another time, you could see how Mike Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, might have been, if anyone was going to be an independent candidate, he might have been a more obvious choice on that front. But he has made clear that he is very committed to electing Democrats. I think that he would not want, my understanding is, folks around him would not want to be in a position where, they take votes from the, a Democratic nominee and maybe help reelect Trump or the Republicans. So it's actually been interesting. He is had a number of different political lives, but this cycle was instrumental in terms of money for Democratic candidates. And in fact, the name that I heard the most from, in terms of from worried Republicans in the last weeks of the campaign was Mike Bloomberg, because he showed up with so much money, and that was evidence of a commitment to helping Democrats this time around. And of course, he was just in Iowa this week, so it'll be interesting to see how an effort in a Democratic field, if he chooses to get in, would go for him this time.
I just want to say I've heard the same thing from Republicans. They were really scared about the way his strategy in how he spent his money in some of these really competitive races, they felt like could mean that he could be very competitive, which is just sort of an interesting thing. Yeah, I think that he would have some significant challenges in a Democratic primary, but
at the same time would also have, resources and it seems to at least be working on maybe shoring up some relationships in some of these early states. Whether he does it is another story, and what a Bloomberg constituency in today's Democratic Party primary base would be is maybe also another story. But no doubt that he's someone who does not seem to be interested in running as an independent this time, but some of his supporters would think that he might have some appeal to independence if he could sort of make it further.
Okay, then let me ask you this question. What do you feel the president has to do to give himself a legitimate shot at being reelected? Or does he have that just by being the Republican nominee?
Yeah, you got a really good start being the nominee toward being reelected. There's a lot of new challenges, and the map is in flux. And it'll be interesting to see. I mean, Florida was competitive this time. Ohio will be interesting. All the Rust Belts will be interesting again. But he'll be on the ballot. That gives him a good head start. So again, it'll be interesting to see who the Democrats nominate to see which states will be in play.
Okay. I thought you guys would be a little more opinionated on some of these topics.
He's viable. He's like, as the Republican nominee, he's definitely in the mix. And I don't think, at least when you asked that question, I thought back to how I felt in September of 2016, thinking, oh, this is Clinton's to lose, which we did. But it also made me question when I walked into my job and teaching and et cetera, like, what do I really know about politics if I was this wrong on the outcome of a presidential election? So I am very wary but yeah, it will be close. The final electoral count may be a little skewed one way or the other, but it's going to come down to a handful of states and a couple of percentage points. It might come down to a Florida recount again. Apparently we can't figure out how to do elections right down there. I mean, we as a country, not any one party. But yeah, it's going to be very close.
I'll be opinionated. Of course he's viable. He's extremely viable. There's all the advantages of incumbency, which are, maximized, even more so when that incumbency means that you're president of the United States. He has the firm support of the Republican Party today, which, that's already a sizable part of the country. The map, as we saw in the Senate race results, is pretty favorable to Republicans. I mean, Florida has now, in the last two cycles, of course, a big electoral prize there, gone Republican. And, just in talking with Democratic operatives across the country privately, I think that there's a lot of people who see, a lot of potentially exciting candidates, but there is no consensus on who can beat Donald Trump. I mean, he has proven his critics wrong on multiple occasions, and, I think that, there is consensus that he would need to be taken very seriously, and that there would need to be some real consideration about how to beat him, because that path is not obvious right now.
I also think that the midterms, I think there were a lot of people that didn't show up for the midterms that will show up for the presidential. I think there are people who are Trump voters. They're motivated by Trump. He made the election this go around about him, but I think he wasn't on the ballot. And so I think you've got people who are just Trump people who are going to show up, and they're a lot of times outside of our traditional coalition. And I think for Donald Trump, in my opinion, I know there's probably wise people who disagree with me for good reasons, but I think it'll come down to less about some of this personality that we talk about with him so much, and a lot more to do with results. A lot more to do with whether or not the economy continues to do well. Are we still at 3% GDP? Are non-farm jobs still up? Have we still added people to the workforce? I think one of the things that is a good indicator for him is it's like the first time since 2010 that we've had statistically significant growth in non-metro areas, population growth, and those tend to be the places where he's done well. And so the fact that there's growth in those areas, I think, is also a good thing for him.
Yeah, I think, look, in terms of viability, the states he won in last cycle, he's got to circle the wagons around those. Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, which is going to be tough, but Pennsylvania, Florida, Iowa, Ohio. If if he gets the majority of those, his path is pretty clear. And look, like we had Democrats, I think, had a pretty good night a few weeks back. But the reality is we still lost the Ohio governor's race. We still lost the Iowa governor's race. Wisconsin was very, very close. Iowa and Michigan. Look, I think Democrats feel really good about having Michigan, but to Jessica's point earlier, sorry, there was no reason for Trump voters to come back out in this cycle in Michigan. And you had a gubernatorial that Bill Schuette wasn't a very good candidate. That was a Republican nominee. Gretchen Whitmer was a good candidate. But even the Senate race, John James was a quality candidate, and Stabenow is a well-known name and well-liked, and it still was a pretty decently close race. And I think we felt really good about what happened in Michigan, but I think for us to think that state's back in the blue column is a huge mistake. And his path to getting back to 270 is not overly complicated.
And to add to his viability, I mean, he hasn't stopped campaigning. Like, he gets around to his base, he makes sure they're with him, he keeps them excited and riled up. And I think that's part of the reason why Republicans were able to see some of the successes that they did see in some of the seats in the midterms. So you add everything that's been discussed on this panel and you can't question his viability. So it's not so much about whether Trump is viable as whether the Democrats are going to put up a candidate that is just as viable or could create an opportunity for a truly competitive 2020 presidential race.
And remember that in 2010, the Democrats took heavy losses in the midterms, and then President Obama was reelected with a fairly comfortable margin. Incumbency matters. There's a reason why the last one-term president was George H.W. Bush.
Okay, I have one last question. So I'm going to ask if we have any audience questions, if you would start queuing up over at the microphone. We're going to have a fair amount of time if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, we'll just conclude early. Everyone, I think I know what everyone's going to say to this, but I absolutely have to ask it. In light of the temporary truce and partisanship during President Bush's funeral services, is there any chance that that's not going to go back to what we have seen next week?
I'll bring up a question that I didn't get to mention on the exit polls. We asked, politically, are Americans becoming more united, more divided, or staying the same? And the more divided number was, I think, 73%. We are not, no one thinks, I think this is a temporary reprieve, and next week will be, maybe tomorrow.
Maybe today.
Maybe today, and I haven't checked Twitter. So it might be, right now, we'll be right back to where we were.
I'll point out that the John McCain funeral felt very similar, and the next week it was back to partisan. And that was in the Senate where his fellow senators were all together, crying, sitting together, and then went and fought. So I think it goes back.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're going to open it up to questions. Now, remember, folks, one brief question. Don't make statements. Ask a question. Go right ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. How have campaigns changed to focus upon getting an electoral college win? I know people have talked about the big states, but it seems to me in the last election, the little states were really important. So have Republican and Democratic campaign strategies changed to try to get electoral college votes?
Well, I'll tell you one little, this is somewhat anecdotal from that perspective, but Nebraska is one, I think, of two states, Nebraska is my home state, is one of two states that doesn't award a winner, it's not a winner-take-all system. So we have, based on our congressional districts, we allot the electoral votes. And so in 2008, President Obama's campaign set up an office in our Omaha metro area and actually ended up winning electoral college votes. So I will say, I think when there's an opportunity, the campaigns are thinking differently about, Nebraska would typically be a fairly foregone conclusion that that would be a Republican vote, but it is, that's something where you can see they've done something a little bit different. Otherwise, I think those which electoral college votes are in play based on the state's that are in play. Some of them are just like California. I don't know what Republican could possibly be competitive there right now. So for a lot of them, you do just kind of have a sense of what's that top tier swing states and what's the next tier, and those are the ones that end up mattering. And to some extent, like a South Carolina, that primary there is really, I mean, you want to get those votes, obviously, but they're always kind of you have to keep in mind where do you have to compete at the end, so that you're not alienating yourselves that way. So I'm not sure and maybe somebody would disagree with me, but that strategy hasn't changed other than the regular tactics that we've had to come up with. I mean, you have to think differently about how you communicate with voters. There's a lot of cord cutters, people that don't subscribe to TV, any kind of cable service. And they don't, they're just not connected. Everything that they're getting is digitally or subscription service. So campaign strategists and managers and candidates think about how are we going to communicate with cord cutters? How are we going to communicate with people who vote early? We need to communicate all of our messages, 90 days early. So I think those are all things that carry over then into a presidential.
Did Nebraska try to change I thought the government tried to.
Yes, we did.
The Republicans tried to change that law of how their electoral votes were allotted.
It got kind of stuck in the legislature, but I imagine it'll be back.
I think the one thing more change comes in the primary process. I mean, you see, especially like when I think of places like Texas and Nevada, like you had, one of the things that President Obama's team really did really well was they learned every single arcane rule that every single state party has. And in Texas, for example, she won the state overall vote by a pretty decent margin in the primary, being Hillary Clinton. And but President Obama knew that if he got, then Senator Obama knew that literally showing up at the doors at 4 a.m. and people camp outside gave you a huge leg up in the caucus, right? I mean, in the caucus, which got him almost to a split vote of Texas when it all said and done. So I think that is where you see strategy and the candidates and campaigns that are ahead of that very early on and make an aggressive strategy. I think that's where you see things changing a lot more than, to Jessica's point, you're not going to see, the reality is Maine is the only other one that to that point where President Trump also went for it and got it by a pretty comfortable margin after it had been for Obama pretty comfortably the last two cycles. But I think other than a few different changing, where you spend resources, not much has changed in that.
Okay, next question.
I have a question about Florida, which is real important because it's such a large swing state in the Electoral College. Democrats took House seats all over the country, often in very Republican districts. Seems like Florida should have been easy, but instead we know what happened. The Democrats lost the Senate and governorship races. We heard some references to Cuban Americans and outreach by Governor Scott. I'm just wondering, any other thoughts on what has been going on in Florida and what people think might be happening in Florida in the future?
Well, look, we still won 2 House races in Florida, I want to point out. But look, one of the things that's happening in Florida too, look, it's a state that is aging, it's getting more diverse, but one of the things that is going to change fundamentally in Florida, there's going to be 1.2 million new people who are going to be voting there, or at least eligible to vote there now, who are probably more than likely going to be at least leaning Democrat overall. So it's a challenging state. It is one of the more, look, when you think about it, just running a campaign there, you're talking about going from, Daytona Beach and all of, the Panhandle, which is, very conservative, very white, going all the way down to, probably one of the more metropolitan cities in the world in Miami. And, it is one of the more, divided just states in general, from top to bottom. So, it is a complex state. Even the races we won are incredibly complex. Like, to your point, the Cuban vote is a very complicated vote for Democrats to figure out. But it's also, it's all going to depend on who the candidate is. But look, I think any time we get into the habit of, and I got into a fight with folks about Ohio, and we're taking that off the map for Democrats. Anybody thinking that we should ever have these hot takes because Ohio went the wrong way one presidential cycle is concerning for me, and I think in Florida in general too. We just got to do a better job. But it is a tough state. I don't think anything. Look, at the end of the day, neither race was a blowout, right? And it wasn't a blowout of presidential in 2016. It certainly wasn't a blowout in 2012. for Obama. It is as true a swing state, I think, as there is in the country right now. I don't know if you feel differently.
No, not at all.
It's also a very expensive state, and Rick Scott was a self-funder. Once he came in, I know a lot of Republican strategists were like, they didn't think it was on the map for a Senate flip or a top target until Rick Scott came in and committed to spending loads and loads of money, which then forced Democrats to spend in a place that they had thought they wouldn't have to spend as much in.
Okay, next question, Gwen.
Well, I'm going to keep the focus in Florida, actually, with my question. One of the, I thought, really interesting results from the midterms was the ballot initiative in Florida about allowing felons to vote. And I'm wondering what impact you guys think that will have on maybe Florida shifting directions.
I think there will be some impact if we're able to organize those who now have that right to vote who didn't have it before. And I think the challenge in working with ex-felons is overcoming all of the myths and kind of stereotypes around and misconceptions around their right to vote and what that means. And getting to ex-felons and having that conversation and convincing them after years of being told that they didn't have this right, that you do have this right, and there will not be backlash if you if you go to execute that right, is probably the greatest challenge, and that takes money, time, resources, and people, good people who understand the complexities that ex-felons have around this issue in particular. So I think there's a great opportunity there if parties or operatives do the work to organize those folks and to get them to the polls, but it takes work and resources to do that. So I don't know that you'll see the impact even in 2020. It may be down the road.
Okay, I am going to ask that everybody who's lined up stay there, but for now, nobody else line up because I think this will probably take us to the end. Next question, please.
Nationally, there are 2 voters who voted for Barack Obama and Donald Trump for every 1 that voted for Mitt Romney and Hillary Clinton. In some counties in Iowa, it's about 15% of the voters that are Obama-Trump voters, and they are the voters that determine the outcome of the last 3 presidential elections. I've heard very little about Obama-Trump voters today, and I'd like for the panel to address that.
It's just a little hard to conceptualize.
I think those voters were some of the people who in the 2016 exit poll would say that they were not feeling any economic benefit. I think those voters have a lot of economic anxiety. They see the national economy doing well, but their personal finances are not. And I think that's the way to get those voters is to speak to their issues. It's real easy to say the national economy is doing well, but if they're not doing well, they don't really care.
And I would just quickly add, I think that we saw mixed results with those voters this cycle. So I spent some time in Illinois 12. It's a southern Illinois district that very much Obama-Trump. And this time around, the Republican, who was a very charismatic incumbent Republican member, he was able to hang on, even though he was running against a pretty strong Democratic candidate. And so that suggested in districts like that, some of those districts, it just the dynamics on the ground have just gotten tough for Democrats. But at the same time, at the statewide level, in a number of states where President Trump was successful in 2016, then at the statewide level, we did see movement back toward the Democrats. I'm thinking, of course, of Michigan and Wisconsin. So kind of mixed results in the Midwest, but I agree that that's going to be a really important constituency for both sides to be thinking about. Republicans, of course, want to maintain those voters, keep them in the fold. They're going to have a clear argument for doing that when President Trump is on the ballot. But at the same time, some of those voters, historically being part of the backbone of the Democratic Party. And, certainly I think the Democrats don't want to cede the Midwest and cede those voters. So it'll be really interesting to see how some of these Democratic candidates are positioning themselves, especially who decides to emphasize that they want to bring those voters back to the fold.
Okay, Ananda?
Hello. Is the country ready to elect a female president?
I would like to point out that a female candidate for president won the majority of the popular vote.
would agree. I hear that argument a lot. I hear a lot of people my age and people not my age. Every time I bring up candidates I think are exciting, say, I just think after 2016 we're not ready to elect a woman. And I wanted to hear the panel's thoughts on that.
Please, go ahead.
Well, I sort of disagree. I mean, Hillary Clinton brought a lot of baggage to this campaign, and I think that was more relevant to people's votes than her gender. Will we have a woman president? Yes. Could we have one in 2020? I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility.
Yeah, I agree with Jennifer. I think you can't look at just one factor of a candidate. I mean, Hillary Clinton has been in our collective consciousness since the 90s. We've known all kinds of things about her, and we know her. And there probably wasn't a whole lot about her that we found out during the election that changed. So,
But her emails.
Well, so of course we did find out about the emails. But I think you can't just assume that somebody voted against her because of her gender, in the same way you can't assume that there are people who voted for Barack Obama and it wasn't because he was African American. They liked what he was saying. So I think it has to be looked at on the whole.
I think even you look at the swing states from this past cycle, in places like Iowa, you saw, woman Republican governors reelected against a guy, and we saw for the first time 2 women elected from the House in the first time ever, and even in places like Texas, you saw 2 Latinas first elected for the first time ever to the House. And I think that in Michigan, right? Like Michigan was a state that's been written a lot about. We elected a woman governor over the incumbent, what was he, the deputy governor or lieutenant governor? Whatever,
No,
it doesn't
he was
matter.
the attorney general.
Attorney General. So, look, I think that it's all going to depend on the candidate and who it is, but yes, I think that, again, to everybody's point, she won the popular vote, and I think that the country is definitely ready to elect a woman if she is the nominee.
Yeah, there are examples of that locally in Johnson County for the Johnson County Commission. You all elected 2 women to the commission, and on a commission that had been all older white male for almost a decade. So you're even seeing some of that movement locally, and I think if you see it locally and on the ground and closer to home, I think that begins to be an indicator of what can happen at higher governmental levels.
And when we asked how important it was to elect more women to public office, 78% of people said it was important. So I think there is, I don't think there's a hesitancy to elect women.
Okay, next question.
I don't want to break your rules, so I'm not going to ask what the hell happened in Arizona. But I'm going to ask first, thanks you all for coming. This is my 3rd one of these, and it's always a great event. What if limits, monetarily and time-wise, were put on the campaigns?
Very interesting question. Kind of like not parliamentary politics, but kind of like some of the rules in Britain about money and time.
So candidates have to spend a lot of time fundraising, right? All those House candidates who won the 40, hopefully 41, should be already on the phones thanking supporters and asking for re-election, which is re-election funds, which is horrible, but the reality we have. Having been a fundraiser, I am an advocate of public financing. In addition, but that's not the only answer, right? Nonpartisan redistricting, excuse me, different ways to get on the ballot. There's all kinds of things we could do to make the process more small d democratic, right? In addition to that, fundraising disclosure needs to be broadened, and this is my personal opinion. End Citizens United allows, not End Citizens United, D.C., you would be upset with me. Citizens United allows corporations, donors, et cetera, to pour massive amounts of money in, which, okay, if that's free speech, that's free speech, we respect the rules, but we have a right to know who's putting it out there and whose money that is. So there are things that could change. If you limit the amount of money and limit the time one is interesting, because how would you draw the line, right? What is the amount of time that is appropriate, and are you then ceding an unfair competitive advantage to the incumbent? Because if they're talking about their legislative achievements, is that campaigning? And are you then abridging our rights to free speech? If I complain about my congressman or woman and it's ahead of that 90 or 120-day deadline, am I breaking the rules and campaigning early? So I don't, those are my personal opinions. I'd be interested in others.
I think the First Amendment is a problem on limiting the time allowed, and I don't know that we want to, because it would then favor. I get the point that they're too loud, they're too long, they're too expensive, that you can't go near a TV because you're afraid of watching a terrible ad. But if you really limit the time, then it's the people with money and the people with name ID that are going to just keep winning this thing, and not allow for folks to be able to build up their awareness and build up their campaign. But I appreciate the sentiment.
Okay, Rachel?
Trump's immigration rhetoric contributed greatly to his 2016 win. The Democrats ran an effective 2018 midterm campaign focusing on health care. What issue do you believe will win the 2020 presidential election?
I always jokingly say that the candidate that will get rid of student loans, or that's the
Said
candidate.
the Bernie supporter.
I'm just saying, I think that's the candidate. You'll get young people, you'll get millennials who are now 40 and still paying Sally Mae. I think if Trump were to say, I'm going to get rid of all student loans, you'd see a shift in how people feel about Trump.
Do you really believe that?
I do. I think, if you look at history, the last time you saw so many young people galvanized was during the draft, right? Because the draft impacted young people directly. What is the issue impacting young people and young people who are getting older and trying to buy homes and live the American dream but can't because Sally Mae keeps calling about these loans you took out 10 years ago? Don't ask me how I know about that. Student loan debt and college tuition, and whether you make it free or you help, with the cost of loan repayment or what have you. I think the candidate that gets on top of that becomes the front runner. And if any of these presidential candidates who are looking to run, take this idea and run with it, I want to be on their campaign. I want to be
I
hired.
actually think it's going to be healthcare again.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it's going to be healthcare again. And I don't think the Republican Party will want it to be healthcare again, and Trump will try to make it immigration and other issues, but.
Well, they'll want it to be healthcare if the general position of the Democratic Party is single payer.
True, and make it a referendum on
Yeah.
single payer, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if they go down that road, but it's not a total loser for Republicans.
Fair.
Okay, Ann?
Okay. The political system that we've been talking about here for a couple of days is really dependent on an election system that people trust and warrants the trust of voters. And I know that there were some ballot issues that were interesting that passed this year, but there were also some situations like in North Carolina and Georgia. And I'm just interested in the panel's thoughts about how we make sure that that the high participation that we saw this year, which I thought was really positive, but people won't want to participate unless they trust the system. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on how we protect that system.
It is like just an open window into our process. It's kind of a weird thing but it's kind of counterintuitive for us, and it was I didn't realize it till I came to the committee. We don't, when there are problems, we send in lawyers immediately and try to fix them, but we also don't want to broadcast them until after Election Day for a variety of reasons, because most importantly being, we don't want voters to feel like it's a hard thing to do, right? Like when people are outside talking about long lines on Election Day, I want to tell them all to shut up, right? Like that's the last thing we want to be hearing, is because we want to make voting should be easy and done quickly. I think, look, it's alarming what's happening. I mean, North Carolina is just bizarre what's happening there. And I think, but I think that, I do think it's a system by and large that obviously needs tinkering, but it is a system that works pretty functionally well. Now, there's people trying to change that obviously every day, but I think we need to, look, I think it is, we have Democrats in general have very good lawyers, and I'm sure the other side does too as well, but I think we need to just, if we held our officials accountable, continue to do that. I think it's a system that we shouldn't be talking about not trusting public. Like, we just shouldn't. That is going to encourage people not to vote, right? But it means fighting the battles we need to fight and continuing to do so. But I don't think there's mass voter fraud out there. I don't think that on either side. And I think when they were talking about busing people into New Hampshire last cycle, just the same way that which is insane. But I think when there is problems, we have to fight them. But I also want to make sure that we don't, get into a place where Democrats are crying wolf and preventing people from voting too.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, but voter suppression is real, and you saw a lot of that. You saw that in Georgia, and people are seeing that. They're being impacted by that. And again, there are certain constituencies that are disproportionately impacted by it. Here in Kansas, we saw that with Hispanic voters and laws put in place by Kobach, or at least attempted policies put into place by Kobach that disenfranchise Hispanic voters and African American voters disproportionately. If you look at the race in Georgia with Abrams, voter suppression is real and people know it. And we can't continue to tell people, if you want to see change, all you have to do is vote. And then they get to the polls and they've got to wait in these long lines, or they're turned away because their vote doesn't count because the signature doesn't match exactly, or all of these kind of like frivolous hoops that you have to jump through to participate in the democratic process, and then chastise these same constituencies for not coming out to vote, or when they turn around and say, well, I don't see the point in voting because my vote doesn't count. On some level, both parties, or we as politicals or operatives, whatever, we have to, speak to that, acknowledge that that's, definitely something that us Americans experience. And be intentional about how we, create change around that. And some of that is, as we've got voters galvanized, how do we divert their attention to races that are not particularly sexy, but really have an impact? The Kansas Secretary of State's race, the former Secretary of State ran for governor. He's out, but who's in now, and how is that going to impact voter suppression in Kansas and laws passed around the ability to vote in Kansas? When there are laws put into place that make it easier for people to vote, people come out and vote. In Minnesota, when they implemented same-day registration, voter registration, and early voting, you saw an increase in voters of 11% coming to the polls. So when people have the opportunity, they participate, but those opportunities have to be created if we want to see what true democracy looks like. And when you have more voters at the polls, research has shown that it benefits both Republican and Democratic candidates. Democrats are not the only ones to benefit from an increase in engagement. If we really want, it goes back to Kelly's earlier point, what type of America do we want to be? Do we want to be an America that allows everyone who is an American to participate in the democratic processes given to them by virtue of being American? Like, do we want to be the America that welcomes, people regardless of their race, gender, and background into the political process, regardless of their economic, ability? Politics is expensive to engage in as an operative. It's hard to climb this ladder. And when you don't have people of color, women, all these constituencies represented at the table, you see these type of issues. What kind of America do we want to be? And so I've gotten off on the soapbox, but it's because voter suppression.
I got room. Come on over. It's good.
Voter suppression is one of those issues. We can't ignore it. How many people who wanted to see, change in Georgia are now discouraged because they feel like an election was snatched from them, right? Because my signature didn't match. I don't know. I think it's problematic. So we need to divert our attention to races and seats that impact these issues. So now that Kobach is out, what are we going to do about who has just been elected Secretary of State? What do we do about who gets elected to the Secretary of State's position in Georgia? Because that's the seat that oversees elections. What do we do about that in Missouri, where we got, voter ID passed in Missouri? What happens when that election comes up again? What do we do to galvanize people to get behind candidates who will put in legislation that allows us to be the best America we can be?
One just very quick point on North Carolina, and if you haven't been following the wild story out of there, my McClatchy colleagues at the Charlotte Observer are doing a great job covering it. But I would note that there is bipartisan appetite for figuring out what happened. There's some pretty serious allegations of concerns involving ballots not being returned, and it is the bipartisan North Carolina State Board of Elections that on a bipartisan basis has multiple times refused to certify that election, and so that, that's why we're learning more about what may have gone on there. So yeah, I would note and flag that at least in North Carolina there does seem to be an appetite from both sides to figure out what happened and to perhaps hold some folks accountable there.
I want to tie it back to the question was how do we protect these systems and kind of tie all of this together and echo both of the points that were made before, but democracy is hard, right? People have to pay attention. You have to give some of your time and your energy. You have to make a decision. You have to show up. You have to vote. But at the same time, the way to protect it is to call it out when people are undermining the institutions that make us Americans as a whole. Yes, we have some Republicans, Democrats, independents, but at the end of the day, we're all one people. We're neighbors, we're a community, we're a nation together. And when people speak out about, to Jason's point, crying wolf about problems that are not factually accurate or existing to create fear and division for political gain, everyone needs to step up and call that out. And not just the members of the other party who are in elected positions, but individuals, citizens, people in his party, and this is kind of like, is the party of Trump the Republican Party? Because Trump has taken over, right? And I know that there are a lot of Republicans who don't agree with Trump, but what is the obligation to stand up and speak out when he does things that hurt our society? When you undermine the confidence in the free press, right? Whether or not you agree with CNN, NBC and their bias or their agenda, or Fox, right? It doesn't call out Fox. We have an obligation, and that's how you protect it, is you stand up, you fight, you're not quiet, and we call these things out.
Okay, last question.
My question sort of segues from that. One of the most surprising results of the midterm elections for me was the gubernatorial election in Kansas. How did Chris Kobach lose in a state that Donald Trump won by 20 points in 2016?
That question, we had a Kansas post-election conference last week. That question was discussed widely, but see if anybody wants to jump in and offer comment.
I want to know what they said last week.
I would say by being Chris Kobach. I mean, he was a less than ideal candidate. The party, the National Party, did not want him as the nominee. He shot Trump into endorsing him towards the end, so he won the primary. But he was pretty damaged goods. So the one thing he did that really hurt himself was Velcro himself to Sam Bradback, whose approval ratings were in the 20s, and he allowed Democrats to run the campaign they wanted. And when I say that, I mean more the DGA and than I do Joan Kelly, but Laura Kelly, is just say, Chris Kobach has 4 more years of Sam Brownback in a state that's really happy he's gone. So that's how it happened.
I was not involved on the race, so anyone here who could jump in, but I read a fascinating article, a postmortem afterwards, that talked about his complete lack of an organization. There were no field people. There were, he didn't really have a campaign office. He just thought he'd win because he was Chris Kobach, right? And that's not a strategy that will work. You set yourself up for failure. But again, that's from reading a postmortem article in
Kansas City Star.
Yeah, that was the Kansas City Star. It was written by Hunter Woodall and I believe Brian Lowry. And Hunter was part of our group last week, and he reiterated some of those points, that it was not at all a traditional campaign.
I'm going to put in one plug for my good friend Jody Ziegler, who managed Laura's race. She was the first person I offered a job to at the DCCC, and luckily for you all, she turned me down. But I think that she ran a tremendous race. And look, there are natural challenges here. We all talked about Brownback, the fact that in 2014, which was a wave against blue, that the fact that, Paul Davis still nearly won that race and was competitive till the end. But look, give Laura credit, deserves a lot of credit too. She ran a hell of a race, and I don't think there was a lot of national optimism in that race until the very end. So I think we should give a tip of the hat to Jordy and Laura as well.
I mean, the other thing that's worth adding is in talking to one of the pollsters involved in the race, and he was involved in a number of states, he said the weird thing about Kansas is that it's not really, the Republican Party isn't really the party of Trump. When you ask them in a poll, 50% said no. He said, when I asked that in Florida, 75% said yes. And I think that probably had an impact because I think you had Republicans who weren't afraid to buck the party.
Yeah, Trump did not win the caucus here, as folks may recall. And Kobach is, we've talked about candidates that have been around a while, that like Hillary Clinton, people have formed strong opinions on her one way or the other. Kobach, not for the same duration perhaps, but especially in parts of eastern Kansas, very much a known quantity. He is someone, as you all know this, of course, but he's got some controversial views. People love him or hate him, but people have had some time to develop some opinions on him. And I know some people, from Johnson County area at least, who were just as motivated to get out and vote against him as they were to participate in the congressional race, actually, and perhaps more motivated. And so that was the fear that a lot of national Republicans had about Kobach winning the nomination. They worried that he would be a drag, down ballot in the 3rd and actually in the 2nd district. And at least in the 3rd district, there's some evidence that may have been the case.
Okay. Well, I would recommend to you that you take a look online at our video of that conference last week, because we spent quite a bit of time discussing that and other topics. And Jordy was here, Jason, and she is an extraordinary person and is going to go very far in the Democratic Party. I don't think it's any secret to any of you who've done these before that this is my favorite program among all the favorite programs I have at the Dole Institute. But this is my most favorite, so I want to thank all of the audience for attending, and I want to thank our panelists. You guys did a fantastic job. So thank you all, and have a safe trip home. That was great, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.